Hey guys, how's it going? Welcome back to my channel. So we're going to be reading some more Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban. We left off on chapter 9 and we're going to start there. Now don't mind the noises, I have a fan running because it's super hot today and my dog decided she wants to eat. So you're going to hear her eating until she's done. Alright, so let's start. Chapter 9, Grim Defeat. Professor Dumbledore sent all the Gryffindors back to the Great Hall, where they were joined 10 minutes later by the students from Hufflepuff, Ravenclaw, and Slytherin, who all looked extremely confused. The teachers and I need to conduct a thorough search of the castle, Professor Dumbledore told them as Professors McGonagall and Flitwick closed all doors into the hall. I'm afraid that, for your own safety, you will have to spend the night here. I want the prefects to stand guard over the entrances to the hall, and I am leaving the head boy and girl in charge. Any disturbance should be reported to me immediately. He added to Percy, who was looking immensely proud and important, "Send word with one of the ghosts." Professor Dumbledore paused, about to leave the hall, and said, "Oh yes, you'll be needing—" One casual wave of his wand, and the long tables flew to the edges of the hall and stood themselves against the walls. Another wave, and the floor was covered with hundreds of squishy purple sleeping bags. "Sleep well," said Professor Dumbledore, closing the door behind him. The hall immediately began to buzz excitedly. The Gryffindors were telling the rest of the school what had just happened. "Everyone into their sleeping bags," shouted Percy. "Come on now, no more talking. Lights out in 10 minutes. "Come on," Ron said to Harry and Hermione. They seized 3 sleeping bags and dragged them into a corner. "Do you think Black's still in the castle?" Hermione whispered anxiously. "Dumbledore obviously thinks he might be," said Ron. "It's very lucky he picked tonight, you know," said Hermione as they climbed fully dressed into their sleeping bags and propped themselves on their elbows to talk. "The one night we weren't in the tower." "I reckon he's lost track of time being on the run," said Ron. "Didn't realize it was Halloween. Otherwise, he'd have come bursting in here." Hermione shuddered. All around them, people were asking one another the same question. How did he get in? "Maybe he knows how to apparate," said a Ravenclaw a few feet away. "Just appear out of thin air, you know." "Disguised himself, probably," said a Hufflepuff 5th year. "He could have flown in," suggested Dean Thomas. "Honestly, am I the only person who's ever bothered to read Hogwarts a history?" said Hermione crossly to Harry and Ron. "Probably," said Ron. "Why?" "Because the castle's protected by more than walls, you know," said Hermione. "There are all sorts of enchantments on it to stop people entering by stealth. You can't just apparate in here, and I'd like to see the disguise that could fool those Dementors. They're guarding every single entrance to the grounds. They'd have seen him fly in, too, and Filch knows all the secret passages. They'll have them covered." "The lights are going out now," Percy shouted. "I want everyone in their sleeping bags and no more talking." The candles all went out at once. The only light now came from the silvery ghosts who were drifting about, talking seriously to the prefects, and the enchanted ceiling, which, like the sky outside, was scattered with stars. What with that and the whispering that still filled the hall, Harry felt as though he were sleeping outdoors in a light wind. Once every hour, a teacher would reappear in the hall to check that everything was quiet. Around 3 in the morning, when many students had finally fallen asleep, Professor Dumbledore came in. Harry watched him looking around for Percy, who had been prowling between the sleeping bags, telling people off for talking. Percy was only a short way away from Harry, Ron, and Hermione, who quickly pretended to be asleep as Dumbledore's footsteps drew nearer. "Any sign of him, Professor?" said Percy in a whisper. "No. All well here?" "Everything under control, sir." "Good. There's no point moving them all now. I found a temporary guardian for the Gryffindor Portrait Hall. You'll be able to move them back in tomorrow." "And the fat lady, sir?" "Hiding in a map of Argyllshire on the 2nd floor. Apparently she refused to let Black in without the password, so he attacked. She's still very distressed, but once she's calmed down, I'll have Mr. Filch restore her." Harry heard the door of the hall creak open again, and more footsteps. "Headmaster." It was Snape. Harry kept quite still, listening hard. "The whole of the 3rd floor has been searched. He's not there, and Filch has done the dungeons. Nothing there either." "What about the astronomy tower, Professor Trelawney's room, the owlry?" "All searched." "Very well, Severus. I didn't really expect Black to linger." "Have you any theory as to how he got in, Professor?" asked Snape. Harry raised his head very slightly off his arms to free his other ear. "Many, Severus, each of them as unlikely as the next." Harry opened his eyes as a fraction and squinted up to where they stood. Dumbledore's back was to him, but he could see Percy's face, rapt with attention, and Snape's profile, which looked angry. "You remember the conversation we had, Headmaster, just before, the start of term?" said Snape, who was barely opening his lips as though trying to block Percy out of the conversation. "I do, Severus," said Dumbledore, and there was something like warning in his voice. "It seems almost impossible that Black could have entered the school without inside help. I did express my concerns when you appointed—" I do not believe a single person inside this castle would have helped Black enter it, said Dumbledore, and his tone made it so clear that the subject was closed that Snape didn't reply. I must go down to the Dementors, said Dumbledore. I said I would inform them when our search was complete. Didn't they want to help, sir? Said Percy. Oh, yes, said Dumbledore coldly, but I'm afraid no Dementor will cross the threshold of this castle while I am headmaster. Percy looked slightly abashed. Dumbledore left the hall, walking quickly and quietly. Snape stood for a moment, watching the headmaster with an expression of deep resentment on his face. Then he, too, left. Harry glanced sideways at Ron and Hermione. Both of them had their eyes open, too, reflecting the starry ceiling. What was all that about? Ron mouthed. The school talked of nothing but Sirius Black for the next few days. The theories about how he had entered the castle became wilder and wilder. Hannah Abbott from Hufflepuff spent much of their next herbology class telling anyone who'd listen that Black could turn into a flowering shrub. The fat lady's ripped canvas had been taken off the wall and replaced with a portrait of Sir Cadogan and his fat gray pony. Nobody was very happy about this. Sir Cadogan spent half his time challenging people to duels, and the rest thinking up ridiculously complicated passwords, which he changed at least twice a day. He's a complete lunatic, said Seamus Finnegan angrily to Percy. Can't we get anyone else? None of the other pictures wanted the job, said Percy, frightened of what happened to the fat lady. Sir Cadogan was the only one brave enough to volunteer. Sir Cadogan, however, was the least of Harry's worries. He was now being closely watched. Teachers found excuses to walk along corridors with him, and Percy Weasley, acting, Harry suspected, on his mother's orders, was tailing him everywhere like an extremely pompous guard dog. To cap it all, Professor McGonagall summoned Harry into her office. With such a somber expression on her face, Harry thought someone must have died. There's no point in hiding it from you any longer, Potter, she said in a very serious voice. I know this will come as a shock to you, but Sirius Black... I know he's after me, said Harry wearily. I heard Ron's dad telling his mom, Mr. Weasley works for the Ministry of Magic. Professor McGonagall seemed very taken aback. She stared at Harry for a moment or two, then said, I see. Well, in that case, Potter, you'll understand why I don't think it's a good idea for you to be practicing Quidditch in the evenings. Out on the field with only your team members, it's very exposed, Potter. We've got our first match on Saturday, said Harry, outraged. I've got to train, Professor. Professor McGonagall considered him intently. Harry knew she was deeply interested in the Gryffindor team's prospects. It had been she, after all, who suggested him as seeker in the first place. He waited, holding his breath. Professor McGonagall stood up and stared out of the window at the Quidditch field, just visible through the rain. Well, goodness knows, I'd like to see us win the cup at last, but all the same, Potter, I'd be happier if a teacher were present. I'll ask Madam Hooch to oversee your training sessions. The weather worsened steadily as the first Quidditch match drew near. Undaunted, the Gryffindor team was training harder than ever under the eye of Madam Hooch. Then at their final training session before Saturday's match, Oliver Wood gave his team some unwelcome news. We're not playing Slytherin, he told them, looking very angry. Flint's just been to see me. We're playing Hufflepuff instead. Why? Chorused the rest of the team. Flint's excuses at their seeker's arms, still injured, said Wood, grinding his teeth furiously. But it's obvious while they're doing it. Don't want to play in this weather. Think it'll damage their chances. There had been strong winds and heavy rain all day, and as Wood spoke, they heard a distant rumble of thunder. There's nothing wrong with Malfoy's arm, said Harry furiously. He's faking it. I know that, but we can't prove it, said Wood bitterly, and we've been practicing all those moves assuming we're playing Slytherin, and instead it's Hufflepuff, and their style's quite different. They've got a new captain and seeker, Cedric Diggory. Angelina, Alicia, and Katie suddenly giggled. What? Said Wood, frowning at this light-hearted behavior. He's that tall, good-looking one, isn't he? Said Angelina. Strong and silent, said Katie, and they started to giggle again. He's only silent because he's too thick to string two words together, said Fred impatiently. I don't know why you're worried, Oliver. Hufflepuff is a pushover. Last time we played them, Harry caught the snitch in about 5 minutes. Remember? We were playing in completely different conditions, Wood shouted, his eyes bulging slightly. Diggory's put a very strong side together. He's an excellent seeker. I was afraid you'd take it like this. We mustn't relax. We must keep our focus. Slytherin is trying to wrong-foot us. We must win. Oliver, calm down, said Fred, looking slightly alarmed. We're taking Hufflepuff very seriously. Seriously. The day before the match, the winds reached howling point and the rain fell harder than ever. It was so dark inside the corridors and classrooms that extra torches and lanterns were lit. The Slytherin team was looking very smug indeed, and none more so than Malfoy. If only my arm was feeling a bit better, he sighed as the gale outside pounded the windows. Harry had no room in his head to worry about anything except the match tomorrow. Oliver Wood kept hurrying up to him between classes and giving him tips. The third time this happened, Wood talked for so long that Harry suddenly realized he was 10 minutes late for Defense Against the Dark Arts and set off at a run with Wood shouting after him. Diggory's got a very fast swerve, Harry, so you might want to try looping him. Harry skidded to a halt outside the Defense Against the Dark Arts classroom, pulled the door open, and dashed inside. "Sorry I'm late, Professor Lupin. But it wasn't Professor Lupin who looked up at him from the teacher's desk. It was Snape. This lesson began 10 minutes ago, Potter, so I think we'll make it 10 points from Gryffindor. Sit down." But Harry didn't move. "Where's Professor Lupin?" he said. "He says he is feeling too ill to teach today," said Snape with a twisted smile. "I believe I told you to sit down." But Harry stayed where he was. "What's wrong with him?" Snape's black eyes glittered. "Nothing life-threatening," he said, looking as though he wished it were. "5 more points from Gryffindor, and if I have to ask you to sit down again, it'll be 50. Harry walked slowly to his seat and sat down. Snape looked around at the class. "As I was saying before," Potter interrupted, "Professor Lupin has not left any record of the topics you have covered so far." "Please, sir, we've done Bogarts, Redcaps, Kappas, and Grindylows," said Hermione quickly, "and we're just about to start." "Be quiet," said Snape coldly. "I did not ask for information. I was merely commenting on Professor Lupin's lack of organization." "He's the best Defense Against the Dark Arts teacher we've ever had," said Dean Thomas boldly, and there was a murmur of agreement from the rest of the class. Snape looked more menacing than ever. "You are easily satisfied. Lupin is hardly overtaxing you. I would expect first years to be able to deal with Redcaps and Grindylows. Today we shall discuss—" Harry watched him flick through the textbook to the very back chapter, which he must know they hadn't covered. "Werewolves," said Snape. "But, sir," said Hermione, seemingly unable to restrain herself, "we're not supposed to do werewolves yet. We're due to start Hinky-Punks." "Miss Granger," said Snape in a voice of deadly calm, "I was under the impression that I am teaching this lesson, not you, and I am telling you all to turn to page 394. He glanced around again. "All of you, now." With many bitter, sidelong looks and some sullen muttering, the class opened their books. "Which of you can tell me how we distinguish between the werewolf and the true wolf?" said Snape. Everyone sat in motionless silence. Everyone except Hermione, whose hand, as it so often did, had shot straight into the air. "Anyone?" Snape said, ignoring Hermione. His twisted smile was back. "Are you telling me that Professor Lupin hasn't even taught you the basic distinction between—" "We told you," said Parvati suddenly. "We haven't got as far as werewolves yet. We're still on—" "Silence!" snarled Snape. Well. I never thought I'd meet a third-year class who wouldn't even recognize a werewolf." Hold on, guys. "When they saw one. I shall make a point of informing Professor Dumbledore how very behind you all are." "Please, sir," said Hermione, whose hand was still in the air. "The werewolf differs from the true wolf in several small ways. The snout of the werewolf—" "This is the second time you have spoken out of turn, Miss Granger," said Snape coolly. 5 more points from Gryffindor for being an insufferable know-it-all." Hermione went very red, put down her hand, and stared at the floor with their eyes full of tears. It was a mark of how much the class loathed Snape that they were all glaring at him, because every one of them had called Hermione a know-it-all at least once, and Ron, who told Hermione she was a know-it-all at least twice a week, said loudly, "You asked us a question, and she knows the answer. Why ask if you don't want to be told?" The class knew instantly he'd gone too far. Snape advanced on Ron slowly, and the room held its breath. "Detention, Weasley," Snape said silkily, his face very close to Ron's. "And if I ever hear you criticize the way I teach a class again, you will be very sorry indeed." No one made a sound throughout the rest of the class. They sat and made notes on werewolves from the textbook, while Snape prowled up and down the rows of desks, examining the work they had been doing with Professor Lupin. "Very poorly explained. That is incorrect. The Kappa is more commonly found in Mongolia. Professor Lupin gave this 8 out of 10. I wouldn't have given it 3. When the bell rang at last, Snape held them back. That's one thing I don't like. Let me know what your guys' intake is, but I've never been a huge fan of Snape. I've always found him to be bitter and teach in a bitter manner and take things out on the students other than Slytherin. And he doesn't seem, he may be a good teacher, but he just doesn't seem to teach very well, in my opinion. He just seems one of those teachers that's just I don't want to be here kind of teacher. That's my take on Snape, though. "You will each write an essay to be handed in to me on the ways you recognize and kill werewolves. I want 2 rolls of parchment on the subject, and I want them by Monday morning. It is time somebody took this class in hand. Weasley, stay behind. We need to arrange your detention." Harry and Hermione left the room with the rest of the class, who waited until they were all out of earshot, then burst into a furious tirade about Snape. "Snape's never been like this with any of our other Defense Against the Dark Arts teachers, even if he did want the job," Harry said to Hermione. "Why's he got it in for Lupin? Do you think this is all because of the Bogart?" "I don't know," said Hermione pensively, "but I really hope Professor Lupin gets better soon." Ron caught up with them 5 minutes later in a towering rage. "Do you know what that—" He called Snape something that made Hermione say, "Ron, is making me do? I've got to scrub out the bedpans in the hospital wing without magic." He was breathing deeply, his fist clenched. Why couldn't Black have hidden in Snape's office, eh? He could have finished him off for us. Harry woke extremely early the next morning, so early that it was still dark. For a moment he thought the roaring of the wind had woken him. Then he felt the cold breeze on the back of his neck and sat bolt upright. Peeves, the poltergeist, had been floating next to him, blowing hard in his ear. "What did you do that for?" said Harry furiously. Peeves puffed out his cheeks, blew hard, and zoomed backward out of the room, cackling. Harry fumbled for his alarm clock and looked at it. It was 4:30. Cursing Peeves, he rolled over and tried to get back to sleep, but it was very difficult, now that he was awake, to ignore the sounds of the thunder rumbling overhead, the pounding of the wind against the castle walls, and the distant creaking of the trees in the forbidden forest. In a few hours he would be out on the Quidditch field, battling through that gale. Finally he gave up any thought of more sleep, got up, dressed, picked up his Nimbus 2000 and walked quietly out of the dormitory. As Harry opened the door, something brushed against his leg. He bent down just in time to grab Crookshanks by the end of his bushy tail. Okay, I don't know what the hell her deal is. He bent down just in time to grab Crookshanks by the end of his bushy tail and drag him outside. "You know, I reckon Ron was right about you," Harry told Crookshanks suspiciously. "There are plenty of mice around this place. Go and chase them. Go on," he added, nudging Crookshanks down the spiral staircase with his foot. "Leave Scabbers alone." The noise of the storm was even louder in the common room. Harry knew better than to think the match would be cancelled. Quidditch matches weren't called off for trifles like thunderstorms. Nevertheless, he was starting to feel very apprehensive. Wood had pointed out Cedric Diggory to him in the corridor. Diggory was a fifth year and a lot bigger than Harry. Seekers were usually light and speedy, but Diggory's weight would be an advantage in this weather because he was less likely to be blown off course. Harry whiled away the hours until dawn in front of the fire, getting up every now and then to stop Crookshanks from sneaking up the boys' staircase again. At long last, Harry thought it must be time for breakfast, so he headed through the portrait hole alone. "Stand and fight, you mangy cur," yelled Sir Cadogan. "Oh, shut up," Harry yawned. He revived a bit over a large bowl of porridge, and by the time he'd started on toast, the rest of the team had turned up. "It's going to be a tough one," Wood said, who wasn't eating anything. "Stop worrying, Oliver," said Alicia soothingly. "We don't mind a bit of rain." But it was considerably more than a bit of rain. Such was the popularity of Quidditch that the whole school turned out to watch the match as usual, but they ran down the lawns toward the Quidditch field, heads bowed against the ferocious wind, umbrellas being whipped out of their hands as they went. Just before he entered the locker room, Harry saw Malfoy, Crabbe, and Goyle laughing and pointing at him from under an enormous umbrella on their way to the stand. On the way to the stadium, sorry. The team changed into their scarlet robes and waited for Wood's usual pre-match pep talk, but it didn't come. He tried to speak several times, made an odd gulping noise, then shook his head hopelessly and beckoned them to follow him. The wind was so strong that they staggered sideways as they walked out onto the field. If the crowd was cheering, they couldn't hear it over the fresh rolls of thunder. Rain was splattering over Harry's glasses. How on earth was he going to see the snitch in this? The Hufflepuffs were approaching from the opposite side of the field, wearing canary yellow robes. The captains walked up to each other and shook hands. Diggory smiled at Wood, but Wood now looked as though he had lockjaw and merely nodded. Harry saw Madam Hooch's mouth form the words, "Mount your brooms." He pulled his right foot out of the mud with a squelch and swung it over his Nimbus 2000. Madam Hooch put her whistle to her lips and gave it a blast that sounded shrill and distant. They were off. Harry rose fast, but his Nimbus was swerving slightly with the wind. He held it as steady as he could and turned, squinting into the rain. Within 5 minutes, Harry was soaked to his skin and frozen, hardly able to see his teammates, let alone the tiny snitch. He flew backward and forward across the field, past blurred red and yellow shapes, with no idea of what was happening in the rest of the game. He couldn't hear the commentary over the wind. The crowd was hidden beneath a sea of cloaks and battered umbrellas. Twice, Harry came very close to being unseated by a bludger. His vision was so clouded by the rain on his glasses, he hadn't seen them coming. He lost track of time. It was getting harder and harder to hold his broom straight. The sky was getting darker, as though night had decided to come early. Twice, Harry nearly hit another player without knowing whether it was a teammate or opponent. Everyone was now so wet and the rain so thick he could hardly tell them apart. With the first flash of lightning came the sound of Madam Hooch's whistle. Harry could just see the outline of Wood through the thick rain, gesturing him to the ground. The whole team splashed down into the mud. "I called for timeout," Wood roared at his team. "Come on, under here." They huddled at the edge of the field under a large umbrella. Harry took off his glasses and wiped them hurriedly on his robes. "What's the score?" "We're 50 points up," said Wood, "but unless we get the snitch soon, we'll be playing into the night." "I've got no chance with these on," Harry said, exasperatedly waving his glasses. At that very moment, Hermione appeared at his shoulder. She was holding her cloak over her head and was inexplicably beaming. "I've had an idea, Harry. Give me your glasses, quick." He handed them to her, and as the team watched in amazement, Hermione tapped them with her wand and said, "Impervious." "There," she said, handing them back to Harry. "They'll repel water." Wood looked as though he could have kissed her. "Brilliant," he called hoarsely after her as she disappeared into the crowd. "Okay, team, let's go for it." Hermione's spell had done the trick. Harry was still numb with cold, still wetter than he'd ever been in his life, but he could see. Full of fresh determination, he urged his broom through the turbulent air, staring in every direction for the snitch, avoiding a bludger, ducking beneath Diggory, who was streaking in the opposite direction. There was another clap of thunder, followed immediately by forked lightning. This was getting more and more dangerous. Harry needed to get the snitch, quickly. He turned, intending to head back toward the middle of the field, but at that moment another flash of lightning illuminated the stands, and Harry saw something that distracted him completely. The silhouette of an enormous, shaggy black dog, clearly imprinted against the sky, motionless in the topmost empty rows of seats. Harry's numb hands slipped on the broom handle, and his nimbus dropped a few feet. Shaking his sodden bangs out of his eyes, he squinted back into the stands. The dog had vanished. "Harry!" came Wood's anguished yell from the Gryffindor goal posts. "Harry, behind you!" Harry looked wildly around. Cedric Diggory was pelting up the field, and a tiny speck of gold was shimmering in the rain-filled air between them. With a jolt of panic, Harry threw himself flat to the broom handle and zoomed toward the snitch. "Come on," he growled at his nimbus as the rain whipped his face. "Faster!" But something odd was happening. An eerie silence was falling across the stadium. The wind, though as strong as ever, was forgetting to roar. It was as though someone had turned off the sound, as though Harry had gone suddenly deaf. What was going on? And then a horribly familiar wave of cold swept over him, inside him, just as he became aware of something moving on the field below. Before he'd had time to think, Harry had taken his eyes off the snitch and looked down. At least 100 Dementors, their hidden faces pointing up at him, were standing beneath him. It was as though freezing water were rising in his chest, cutting his insides, and then he heard it again. Someone was screaming, screaming inside his head. A woman. "Not Harry. Not Harry. Please, not Harry. Stand aside, you silly girl. Stand aside now. Not Harry, please. No. Take me. Kill me instead." Numbing, swirling white mist was filling Harry's brain. What was he doing? Why was he flying? He needed to help her. She was going to die. She was going to be murdered. He was falling through the icy mist. "Not Harry. Please, have mercy. Have mercy." A shrill voice was laughing. The woman was screaming, and Harry knew no more. "Lucky the ground was so soft. I thought he was dead for sure, but he didn't even break his glasses." Harry could hear the voices whispering, but they made no sense whatsoever. He didn't have a clue where he was, or how he got there, or what he'd been doing before he got there. All he knew was that every inch of him was aching as though he had been beaten. That was the scariest thing I've ever seen in my life. The scariest thing. Hooded black figures, cold, screaming. Harry's eyes snapped open. He was lying in the hospital wing. The Gryffindor Quidditch team, spattered with mud from head to foot, was gathered around his bed. Ron and Hermione were also there, looking as though they'd just climbed out of a swimming pool. "Harry," said Fred, who looked extremely white underneath the mud, "how are you feeling?" It was as though Harry's memory was on fast forward. The lightning, the Grim, the snitch, and the Dementors. "What happened?" he said, sitting up so suddenly they all gasped. "You fell off," said Fred. "Must have been, 50 feet? We thought you died," said Alicia, who was shaking. Hermione made a small squeaky noise. Her eyes were extremely bloodshot. "But the match," said Harry. "What happened? Are we doing a replay?" No one said anything. The horrible truth sank into Harry like a stone. "We didn't lose. Diggory got the snitch," said George, "just after you fell. He didn't realize what had happened. When he looked back and saw you on the ground, he tried to call it off, wanted a rematch. But they won fair and square. Even Wood admits it." "Where is Wood?" said Harry, suddenly realizing he wasn't there. "Still in the shower," said Fred. "We think he's trying to drown himself." Harry put his face to his knees, his hands gripping his hair. Fred grabbed his shoulder and shook it roughly. "Come on, Harry. You've never missed a snitch before." "There had to be one time you didn't get it," said George. "It's not over yet," said Fred. "We lost by 100 points, right? So if Hufflepuff loses to Ravenclaw and we beat Ravenclaw and Slytherin, Hufflepuff will have to lose by at least 200 points," said George. "But if they beat Ravenclaw?" "No way, Ravenclaw is too good. But if Slytherin loses against Hufflepuff?" "It all depends on the points. A margin of 100 either way." Harry lay there, not saying a word. They had lost. For the first time ever, he had lost a Quidditch match. After 10 minutes or so, Madame Pomfrey came over to tell the team to leave him in peace. "We'll come to see you later," Fred told him. "Don't beat yourself up, Harry. You're still the best seeker we've ever had." The team trooped out, trailing Mud behind them. Madame Pomfrey shut the door behind them, looking disapproving. Ron and Hermione moved nearer to Harry's bed. "Dumbledore was really angry," Hermione said in a quaking voice. "I've never seen him like that before. He ran onto the field as you fell, waved his wand, and you sort of slowed down before you hit the ground. Then he whirled his wand at the Dementors, shot silvery stuff at them. They left the stadium right away. He was furious they'd come onto the grounds. We heard him. Then he magicked you onto a stretcher," said Ron, "and walked up to the up to school with you floating on it. Everyone thought you were." His voice faded, but Harry hardly noticed. He was thinking about what the Dementors had done to him, about the screaming voice. He looked up and saw Ron and Hermione looking at him so anxiously that he quickly cast around for something matter-of-fact to say. "Did someone get my Nimbus?" Ron and Hermione looked quickly at each other. What?" said Harry, looking from one to the other. "Well, when you fell off, it got blown away," said Hermione hesitantly, and it hit. It hit. Oh, Harry, it hit the Whomping Willow." Harry's insides lurched. The Whomping Willow was a very violent tree that stood alone in the middle of the grounds. "And," he said, dreading the answer. "Well, you know the Whomping Willow," said Ron. It doesn't like being hit." "Professor Flitwick brought it back just before you came around," said Hermione in a very small voice. Slowly she reached down for a bag at her feet, turned it upside down, and tipped a dozen bits of splintered wood and twig onto the bed, the only remains of Harry's faithful, finally beaten broomstick. And in the movie, Ron is the one holding it, and it doesn't come out of a bag. He's got it held in his hands, like wrapped up in like a burlap sack or something. So in the movie, it's very different. There's a lot of things I've noticed from the movie that are completely different than the book. Alright, Chapter 10, The Marauder's Map. Madame Pomfrey insisted on keeping Harry in the hospital wing for the rest of the weekend. He didn't argue or complain, but he wouldn't let her throw away the shattered remnants of his Nimbus 2000. He knew he was being stupid, knew that the Nimbus was beyond repair, but Harry couldn't help it. He felt as though he'd lost one of his best friends. He had a stream of visitors, all intent on cheering him up. Hagrid sent him a bunch of earwiggy flowers that looked like yellow cabbages, and Ginny Weasley, blushing furiously, turned up with a get-well card she had made herself, which sang shrilly unless Harry kept it shut under his bowl of fruit. The Gryffindor team visited again on Sunday morning, this time occupied by Wood, who told Harry in a hollow, dead sort of voice that he didn't blame him in the slightest. Ron and Hermione left Harry's bedside only at night, but nothing anyone said or did could make Harry feel any better, because they knew only half of what was troubling him. He hadn't told anyone about the Grim, not even Ron and Hermione, because he knew Ron would panic and Hermione would scoff. The fact remained, however, that it had now appeared twice, and both appearances had been followed by near-fatal accidents. The first time, he had nearly been run over by the night bus. The second, fallen 50 feet from his broomstick. Was the Grim going to haunt him until he actually died? Was he going to spend the rest of his life looking over his shoulder for the beast? And then there were Dementors. Harry felt sick and humiliated every time he thought of them. Everyone said the Dementors were horrible, but no one else collapsed every time they went near one. No one else heard echoes in their head of their dying parents. Because Harry knew who that screaming voice belonged to now. He had heard her words, heard them over and over again during the night hours in the hospital wing while he lay awake, staring at the strips of moonlight on the ceiling. When the Dementors approached him, he heard the last moments of his mother's life, her attempts to protect him, Harry, from Lord Voldemort, and Voldemort's laughter before he murdered her. Harry dozed fitfully, sinking into dreams full of clammy, rotted hands and petrified pleading, jerking awake to dwell again on his mother's voice. It was a relief to return to the noise and bustle of the main school on Monday, where he was forced to think about other things, even if he had to endure Draco Malfoy's taunting. Malfoy was almost beside himself with glee at Gryffindor's defeat. He had finally taken off his bandages and celebrated having the full use of both arms again by doing spirited imitations of Harry falling off his broom. Malfoy spent much of their next potions class doing Dementor imitations across the dungeon. Ron finally cracked and flung a large, slippery crocodile heart at Malfoy, which hit him in the face and caused Snape to take 50 points from Gryffindor. "If Snape's teaching defense against the dark arts again, I'm skiving off," said Ron as they headed toward Lupin's classroom after lunch. "Check who's in there, Hermione." Hermione peered around the classroom door. "It's okay." Professor Lupin was back at work. It certainly looked as though he had been ill. His old robes were hanging more loosely on him, and there were dark shadows beneath his eyes. Nevertheless, he smiled at the class as they took their seats, and they burst at once into an explosion of complaints about Snape's behavior while Lupin had been ill. "It's not fair. He was only filling in. Why should he give us homework?" "We don't know anything about werewolves." 2 rolls of parchment. "Did you tell Professor Snape we haven't covered them yet?" Lupin asked, frowning slightly. The babble broke out again. "Yes, but he said we were really behind." "He wouldn't listen." 2 rolls of parchment. Professor Lupin smiled at the look of indignation on every face. "Don't worry. I'll speak to Professor Snape. You don't have to do the essay." "Oh no," said Hermione, looking very disappointed. "I've already finished it." They had a very enjoyable lesson. Professor Lupin had brought along a glass box containing a Hinky-Punk, a little one-legged creature who looked as though he were made of wisps of smoke, rather frail and harmless-looking. "Lures travelers into bogs," said Professor Lupin as he took notes. "You notice the lantern dangling from his hand. Hops ahead, people follow the light. Then, the Hinky Punk made a horrible squelching noise against the glass. When the bell rang, everyone gathered up their things and headed for the door, Harry among them. But, wait a moment, Harry, Lupin called. I'd like a word. Harry doubled back and watched Professor Lupin covering the Hinky Punk's box with a cloth. I heard about the match, said Lupin, turning back to his desk, and started to pile books into his briefcase. And I'm sorry about your broomstick. Is there any chance of fixing it? No, said Harry. The tree smashed it to bits. Lupin sighed. They planted the Whomping Willow in the same year that I arrived at Hogwarts. People used to play a game, trying to get near enough to touch the trunk. In the end, a boy called Davy Gudgeon nearly lost an eye, and we were forbidden to go near it. No broomstick would have a chance. Did you hear about the Dementors, too? Said Harry with difficulty. Lupin looked at him quickly. Yes, I did. I don't think any of us have seen Professor Dumbledore that angry. They have been growing restless for some time, furious at his refusal to let them inside the grounds. I suppose they were the reason you fell. Yes, said Harry. He hesitated, and then the question he had to ask burst from him before he could stop himself. Why? Why do they affect me like that? Am I just... It has nothing to do with weakness, said Professor Lupin sharply, as though he had read Harry's mind. The Dementors affect you worse than the others because there are horrors in your past that the others don't have. A ray of wintry sunlight fell across the classroom, illuminating Lupin's gray hairs and the lines on his young face. Dementors are among the foulest creatures that walk this earth. They infest the darkest, filthiest places. They glory in decay and despair. They drain peace, hope, and happiness out of the air around them. Even muggles feel their presence, though they can't see them. Get too near a Dementor, and every good feeling, every happy memory will be sucked out of you. If it can, the Dementor will feed on you long enough to reduce you to something like itself, soulless and evil. You'll be left with nothing but the worst experiences of your life, and the worst that happened to you, Harry, is enough to make anyone fall off their broom. You have nothing to feel ashamed of. When they get near me, Harry stared at Lupin's desk, his throat tight. I can hear Voldemort murdering my mom. Lupin made a sudden motion with his arm as though to grip Harry's shoulder, but thought better of it. There was a moment's silence then. Why did they have to come to the match? Said Harry bitterly. They're getting hungry, said Lupin coolly, shuttering his briefcase with a snap. Dumbledore won't let them into the school, so their supply of human prey has dried up. I don't think they could resist the large crowd around the Quidditch field. All that excitement, emotions running high, it was their idea of a feast. Azkaban must be terrible, Harry muttered. Lupin nodded grimly. The fortress is set on a tiny island way out to sea, but they don't need walls and water to keep the prisoners in, not when they're all trapped inside their own heads, incapable of a single cheerful thought. Most of them go mad within weeks. But Sirius Black escaped from them, Harry said slowly. He got away. Lupin's briefcase slipped from his desk. He had to stoop quickly to catch it. Yes, he said, straightening up. Black must have found a way to fight them. I wouldn't have believed it possible. Dementors are supposed to drain a wizard of his powers if he is left with them too long. You made that Dementor on the train back off, said Harry suddenly. There are certain defenses one can use, said Lupin, but there was only one Dementor on the train. The more there are, the more difficult it becomes to resist. What defenses? Said Harry at once. Can you teach me? I don't pretend to be an expert at fighting Dementors, Harry. Quite the contrary. But if the Dementors come to another Quidditch match, I need to be able to fight them. Lupin looked into Harry's determined face, hesitated, then said, Well, all right. I'll try and help, but it'll have to wait until next term, I'm afraid. I have a lot to do before the holidays. I chose a very inconvenient time to fall ill. What with the promise of anti-dementor lessons from Lupin, the thought that he might never have to hear his mother's death again, and the fact that Ravenclaw flattened Hufflepuff in their Quidditch match at the end of November, Harry's mood took a definite upturn. Gryffindor were not out of the running after all. Although they could not afford to lose another match, Wood became repossessed of his manic energy and worked his team as hard as ever in the chilly haze of rain that persisted into December. Harry saw no hint of a Dementor within the grounds. Dumbledore's anger seemed to be keeping them at their stations at the entrances. 2 weeks before the end of the term, the sky lightened suddenly to a dazzling opaline white, and the muddy grounds were revealed one morning covered in glittering frost. Inside the castle there was a buzz of Christmas in the air. Professor Flitwick, the charms teacher, had already decorated his classroom with shimmering lights that turned out to be real fluttering fairies. The students were all happily discussing their plans for the holidays. Both Ron and Hermione had decided to remain in Hogwarts, and though Ron said it was because he couldn't stand 2 weeks with Percy, and Hermione insisted she needed to use the library, Harry wasn't fooled. They were doing it to keep him company, and he was very grateful. To everyone's delight except Harry's, there was to be another Hogsmeade trip on the very last weekend of the term. We can do all our Christmas shopping there, said Hermione. Mom and Dad would really love those tooth-flossing string mints from Honeydukes. Resigned to the fact that he would be the only third year staying behind again, Harry borrowed a cup of which broomstick from Wood and borrowed a copy, of Which Broomstick from Wood, and decided to spend the day reading up on the different makes. He had been riding one of the school brooms at team practice, an ancient shooting star which was very slow and jerky. He definitely needed a new broom of his own. On the Saturday morning of the Hogsmeade trip, Harry bid goodbye to Ron and Hermione, who were wrapped in cloaks and scarves, then turned up the marble staircase alone and headed back toward Gryffindor Tower. Snow had started to fall outside the windows, and the castle was very still and quiet. "Psst, Harry!" He turned, halfway along the third-floor corridor, to see Fred and George peering out at him from behind a statue of a humpbacked, one-eyed witch. "What are you doing?" said Harry curiously. "How come you're not going to Hogsmeade?" "We've come to give you a bit of festive cheer before we go," said Fred with a mysterious wink. "Come in here." He nodded toward an empty classroom to the left of the one-eyed statue. Harry followed Fred and George inside. George closed the door quietly and then turned, beaming, to look at Harry. "Early Christmas present for you, Harry," he said. Fred pulled something from inside his cloak with a flourish and laid it on one of the desks. It was a large, square, very worn piece of parchment with nothing written on it. Harry, suspecting one of Fred and George's jokes, stared at it. "What's that supposed to be?" "This, Harry, is the secret of our success," said George, patting the parchment fondly. "It's a wrench. Giving it to you," said Fred. "But we decided last night your needs greater than ours." "Anyway, we know it by heart," said George. "We bequeath it to you. We don't really need it anymore." "And what do I need with a bit of old parchment?" said Harry. "A bit of old parchment," said Fred, closing his eyes with a grimace as though Harry had mortally offended him. "Explain, George." "Well, when we were in our first year, Harry, young, carefree, and innocent," Harry snorted. He doubted whether Fred and George had ever been innocent. "Well, more innocent than we are now. We got into a spot of bother with Filch. We let off a dung bomb in the corridor, and it upset him for some reason. So he hauled us off to his office and started threatening us with the usual detention, disembowelment, and we couldn't help noticing a drawer in one of his filing cabinets marked confiscated and highly dangerous." "Don't tell me," said Harry, starting to grin. "Well, what would you've done?" said Fred. "George caused a diversion by dropping another dung bomb. I whipped the drawer open and grabbed this." "It's not as bad as it sounds, you know," said George. "We don't reckon Filch ever found out how to work it. He probably suspected what it was, though, or he wouldn't have confiscated it." "And you know how to work it?" "Oh, yes," said Fred, smirking. "This little beauty's taught us more than all the teachers in this school." "You're winding me up," said Harry, looking at the ragged old bit of parchment. "Oh, are we?" said George. He took out his wand, touched the parchment lightly, and said, "I solemnly swear that I am up to no good." And at once, thin ink lines began to spread like a spider's web from the point that George's wand had touched. They joined each other, they crisscrossed, they fanned into every corner of the parchment. Then words began to blossom across the top, great curly green words that proclaimed, "Messrs. Moony, Wormtail, Padfoot, and Prongs, purveyors of aids to magical mischief makers, are proud to present the Marauder's Map." It was a map showing every detail of the Hogwarts castle and grounds, but the truly remarkable thing were the tiny ink dots moving around it, each labeled with a name in minuscule writing. Astounded, Harry bent over it. A labeled dot in the top left corner showed that Professor Dumbledore was pacing his study. The caretaker's cat, Mrs. Norris, was prowling the second floor, and Peeves the poltergeist was currently bouncing around the trophy room. And as Harry's eyes traveled up and down the familiar corridors, he noticed something else. This map showed a set of passages he had never entered, and many of them seemed to lead right into Hogsmeade, said Fred, tracing one of them with his finger. "There are 7 in all. Now Filch knows about these 4. He pointed them out. "But we're sure we're the only ones who know about these. Don't bother with the one behind the mirror on the 4th floor. We used it until last winter, but it's caved in, completely blocked. And we don't reckon anyone's ever used this one because the Whomping Willow's planted right over the entrance. But this one leads right into the cellar of Honeydukes. We've used it loads of times, and as you might have noticed, the entrance is right outside this room, through that one-eyed old crone's hump." "Moony, Wormtail, Padfoot, and Prongs," sighed George, patting the heading of the map. "We owe them so much. Noble men working tirelessly to help a new generation of lawbreakers," said Fred solemnly. "Right," said George briskly. "Don't forget to wipe it after you've used it, or anyone can read it," Fred said warningly. "Just tap it again and say 'Mischief Managed,' and it'll go blank." "So, young Harry," said Fred in an uncanny impersonation of Percy, "mind you behave yourself." "See you in Honeydukes," said George, winking. They left the room, both smirking in a satisfied sort of way. Harry stood there, gazing at the miraculous map. He watched the tiny ink, Mrs. Norris turned left and paused to sniff at something on the floor. If Filch really didn't know, he wouldn't have to pass the Dementors at all. But even as he stood there, flooding with excitement, something Harry had once heard Mr. Weasley say came floating out of his memory. Never trust anything that can think for itself, if you can't see where it keeps its brain. This map was one of those dangerous magical objects Mr. Weasley had been warning against, aids for magical mischief makers. But then, Harry reasoned, he only wanted to use it to get into Hogsmeade. It wasn't as though he wanted to steal anything or attack anyone, and Fred and George had been using it for years without anything horrible happening. Harry traced the secret passage to Honeydukes with his finger. Then, quite suddenly, as though following orders, he rolled up the map, stuffed it inside his robes, and hurried to the door of the classroom. He opened it a couple of inches. There was no one outside. Very carefully, he edged out of the room and behind the statue of the One-Eyed Witch. What did he have to do? He pulled out the map again and saw, to his astonishment, that a new ink figure had appeared upon it, labeled Harry Potter. This figure was standing exactly where the real Harry was standing, about halfway down the third-floor corridor. Harry watched carefully. His little ink self appeared to be tapping the witch with his minute wand. Harry quickly took out his real wand and tapped the statue. Nothing happened. He looked back at the map. The tiniest speech bubble had appeared next to his figure. The word inside said Descendium. Descendium, Harry whispered, tapping the stone witch again. At once, the statue's hump opened wide enough to admit a fairly thin person. Harry glanced quickly up and down the corridor, then tucked the map away again, hoisted himself into the hole head first, and pushed himself forward. He slid a considerable way down, what felt like a stone slide, then landed on cold, damp earth. He stood up, looking around. It was pitch dark. He held up his wand, muttered Lumos, and saw that he was in a very narrow, low, earthy passageway. He raised the map, tapped it with the tip of his wand, and muttered, Mischief managed. The map went blank at once. He folded it carefully, tucked it inside his robes, then, heart beating fast, both excited and apprehensive, he set off. The passage twisted and turned more like the burrow of a giant rabbit than anything else. Harry hurried along it, stumbling now and then on the uneven earth, holding his wand out in front of him. It took ages, but Harry had the thought of Honeydukes to sustain him. After what felt like an hour, the passage began to rise. Harry, panting... Oh, sorry, I read that wrong. Panting, Harry sped up, his face hot, his feet very cold. 10 minutes later, he came to the foot of some worn stone steps, which rose out of sight above him. Careful not to make any noise, Harry began to climb. And under 100 steps, 200 steps, he lost count as he climbed, watching his feet. Then, without warning, his head hit something hard. It seemed to be a trap door. Harry stood there, massaging the top of his head, listening. He couldn't hear any sounds above him. Very slowly, he pushed the trap door open and peered over the edge. He was in his cellar, which was full of wooden crates and boxes. Harry climbed out of the trap door and replaced it. It blended so perfectly with the dusty floor that it was impossible to tell it was there. Harry crept slowly toward the wooden staircase that led upstairs. Now he could definitely hear voices, not to mention the tinkle of a bell and the opening and shutting of a door. Wondering what he ought to do, he suddenly heard a door open much closer at hand. Somebody was about to come downstairs, and get another box of jelly slugs, dear. They've nearly cleaned us out, said a woman's voice. A pair of feet was coming down the staircase. Harry leapt behind an enormous crate and waited for the footsteps to pass. He heard the man shifting boxes against the opposite wall. He might not get another chance. Quickly and silently, Harry dodged out from his hiding place and climbed the stairs. Looking back, he saw an enormous backside and shiny bald head buried in a box. Harry reached the door at the top of the stairs, slipped through it, and found himself behind the counter of Honeydukes. He ducked, crept sideways, and then straightened up. Honeydukes was so crowded with Hogwarts students that no one looked twice at Harry. He edged among them, looking around, and suppressed a laugh as he imagined the look that would spread over Dudley's piggy face if he could see where Harry was now. There were shelves upon shelves of the most succulent-looking sweets imaginable. Creamy chunks of nougat, shimmering pink squares of coconut ice, fat, honey-colored toffees, hundreds of different kinds of chocolate in neat rows. There was a large barrel of every flavor beans, and another of fizzing Whizbees, the levitating sherbet balls that Ron had mentioned. Along yet another wall were special effects, sweets, Drubel's best blowing gum, which filled a room with bluebell-colored bubbles that refused to pop for days. The strange, splintery tooth-flossing string mints, tiny black pepper imps. Breathe fire for your friends. Ice mice, hear your teeth chatter and squeak. Peppermint creams shaped like toads hop realistically in the stomach. Fragile sugar-spun quills and exploding bonbons. Harry squeezed himself through a crowd of sixth years and saw a sign hanging in the farthest corner of the shop, Unusual Tastes, Ron and Hermione were standing underneath it, examining a tray of blood-flavored lollipops. Harry sneaked up behind them. Ugh, no. Harry won't want one of those. They're for vampires, I expect, Hermione was saying. How about these? Said Ron, shoving a jar of cockroach clusters under Hermione's nose. Definitely not, said Harry. Ron nearly dropped the jar. Harry? Squealed Hermione. What are you doing here? How did you... Wow, said Ron, looking very impressed. You've learned to apparate. Of course I haven't, said Harry. He dropped his voice so none of the sixth years could hear him and told them all about the Marauders map. How come Fred and George never gave it to me? Said Ron, outraged. I'm their brother. But Harry isn't going to keep it, said Hermione, as though the idea were ludicrous. He's going to hand it in to Professor McGonagall. Aren't you, Harry? No, I'm not, said Harry. Are you mad? Said Ron, goggling at Hermione. Hand in something that good. If I hand it in, I'll have to say where I got it. Filch would know Fred and George had nicked it. But what about Sirius Black? Hermione hissed. He could be using one of the passages on that map to get into the castle. The teachers have got to know. He can't be getting in through a passage, said Harry quickly. There are 7 secret tunnels on the map, right? Fred and George reckon Filch already knows about 4 of them. And of the other 3, one of them's caved in, so no one can get through it. One of them's got the Whomping Willow planted over the entrance, so you can't get out of it. And the one I just came through, well, it's really hard to see the entrance to it down in the cellar, so unless he knew it was there. Harry hesitated. What if Black did know the passage was there? Ron, however, cleared his throat significantly and pointed to a notice pasted on the inside of the sweet shop door. By order of the Ministry of Magic, customers are reminded that until further notice, Dementors will be patrolling the streets of Hogsmeade every night after sundown. This measure has been put in place for the safety of Hogsmeade residents and will be lifted upon the recapture of Sirius Black. It is therefore advisable that you complete your shopping well before nightfall. Merry Christmas. See, said Ron quietly, I'd like to see Black try and break into Honeydukes with Dementors swarming all over the village. Anyway, Hermione, the Honeydukes owners would hear a break-in, wouldn't they? They live over the shop. Yes, but... Hermione seemed to be struggling to find another problem. Look, Harry still shouldn't be coming into Hogsmeade. He hasn't got a signed form. If anyone finds out, he'll be in so much trouble, and it's not nightfall yet. What if Sirius Black turns up today? Now? He'd have a job spotting Harry in this, said Ron, nodding through the mullioned windows at the thick, swirling snow. Come on, Hermione, it's Christmas. Harry deserves a break. Hermione bit her lip, looking extremely worried. Are you going to report me? Harry asked her, grinning. Oh, of course not. But honestly, Harry... Seen the fizzing Whizbees, Harry, said Ron, grabbing him and leading him over to their barrel. And the jelly slugs and the acid pops. Fred gave me one of those when I was 7. It burnt a hole right through my tongue. I remember Mum walloping him with her broomstick. Ron stared broodingly into the acid pop box. Reckon Fred'd take a bit of a cockroach cluster if I told him they were peanuts. When Ron and Hermione had paid for all their sweets, the 3 of them left Honeydukes for the blizzard outside. Hogsmeade looked like a Christmas card. The little thatched cottages and shops were all covered in a layer of crisp snow. There were holly wreaths on the doors and strings of enchanted candles hanging on the trees. Harry shivered, unlike the other 2. He didn't have his cloak. They headed up the street, heads bowed against the wind. Ron and Hermione shouting through their scarves. That's the post office. Zonko's is up there. We could go up to the Shrieking Shack. Tell you what, said Ron, his teeth chattering. Shall we go for a butterbeer and the 3 broomsticks? Harry was more than willing. The wind was fierce and his hands were freezing, so they crossed the road and in a few minutes were entering the tiny inn. It was extremely crowded, noisy, warm, and smoky. A curvy sort of woman with a pretty face was serving a bunch of rowdy warlocks up at the bar. That's Madame Rosmerta, said Ron. I'll get the drinks, shall I? He added, going slightly red. Harry and Hermione made their way to the back of the room, where there was a small vacant table between the window and a handsome Christmas tree, which stood next to the fireplace. Ron came back 5 minutes later, carrying 3 foaming tankards of hot butterbeer. Merry Christmas, he said, happily raising his tankard. Harry drank deeply. It was the most delicious thing he'd ever tasted and seemed to heat every bit of him from the inside. A sudden breeze ruffled his hair. The door of the 3 broomsticks had opened again. Harry looked over the rim of his tankard and choked. Professors McGonagall and Flitwick had just entered the pub with a flurry of snowflakes, shortly followed by Hagrid, who was deep in conversation with a portly man in a lime-green boiler hat and a pin-stripped cloak, Cornelius Fudge, Minister of Magic. In an instant, Ron and Hermione had both placed their hands on the top of Harry's head and forced him off his stool and under the table. Dripping with butterbeer and crouched out of sight, Harry clutched his empty tankard and watched the teachers and Fudge's feet move toward the bar, pause, then turn and walk right toward him. Somewhere above him, Hermione whispered, Mobiliarbus, I think is how you say it. Mobiliarbus. The Christmas tree beside the table rose a few inches off the ground, drifted sideways, and landed with a soft thump right in front of their table, hiding them from view. Staring through the dense lower branches, Harry saw 4 sets of chair legs move back from the table right beside theirs, then heard the grunts and sighs of the teachers and minister as they sat down. Next he saw another pair of feet, wearing sparkly turquoise high heels, and heard a woman's voice. Oh God, it's this lady. I can't stand this damn lady. A small gilly water. Mine, said Professor McGonagall's voice. 4 pints of mulled mead. Ta, Rosmerta, said Hagrid. A cherry syrup and soda with ice and umbrella. Said Professor Flitwick, smacking his lips. So you'll be the red currant rum, Minister. Thank you, Rosmerta, my dear, said Fudge's voice. Lovely to see you again, I must say. Have one yourself, won't you? Come and join us. Well, thank you very much, Minister. Harry watched the glittering heels march away and back again. His heart was pounding uncomfortably in his throat. Why hadn't it occurred to him that this was the last weekend of term for the teachers, too? I actually thought that high heel was somebody else, so I didn't realize it was the barkeeper, because there's another person that, if you've watched the movies, there's a lady that actually joins them in the movies, and that's who I thought it was, is that lady, and I can't stand that lady from the Ministry of Magic. But if they're not mentioning her here yet, then we should be okay, but I think she comes up in this chapter, to be honest, because she's from the Ministry of Magic, and if Cornelius Fudge is here, that lady is there, but the movies and the book differ, so she might not be a part of this yet, but we'll find out. Harry watched the glittering heels march away and back again. His heart was pounding uncomfortably in his throat. Why hadn't it occurred to him that this was the last weekend of term for the teachers, too? And how long were they going to sit there? He needed time to sneak back on a Honeydukes if he wanted to return to school tonight. Hermione's leg gave a nervous twitch next to him. So what brings you to this neck of the woods, Minister? Came Madame Rosmerta's voice. Harry saw the lower part of Fudge's thick body twist in his chair, as though he were checking for eavesdroppers. Then he said in a quiet voice, What else, my dear, but Sirius Black? I dare say you heard what happened up at the school at Halloween. I did hear a rumor, admitted Madame Rosmerta. Did you tell the whole pub, Hagrid? Said Professor McGonagall exasperately. Do you think Black's still in the area, Minister? Whispered Madame Rosmerta. I'm sure of it, said Fudge shortly. You know that the Dementors have searched the whole village twice, said Madame Rosmerta, a slight edge to her voice. Scared all my customers away. It's very bad for business, Minister. Rosmerta, my dear, I don't like them any more than you do, said Fudge uncomfortably. Necessary precaution, unfortunate, but there you are. I've just met some of them. They're in a fury against Dumbledore. He won't let them inside the castle grounds. I should think not, said Professor McGonagall sharply. How are we supposed to teach with those horrors floating around? Hear, hear, squeaked tiny Professor Flitwick, whose feet were dangling a foot from the ground. All the same, demurred Fudge, they are here to protect you all from something much worse. We all know what Black's capable of. Do you now? I still have trouble believing it, said Madame Rosmerta thoughtfully. Of all the people to go over to the dark side, Sirius Black was the last I'd have thought. I mean, I remember him when he was a boy at Hogwarts. If you'd told me then what he was going to become, I'd have said you'd had too much mead. You don't know the half of it, Rosmerta, said Fudge gruffly. The worst he did isn't widely known. The worst, said Madame Rosmerta, her voice alive with curiosity. Worse than murdering all those poor people, you mean? I certainly do, said Fudge. I can't believe that. What could possibly be worse? You say you remember him at Hogwarts, Rosmerta, murmured Professor McGonagall. Do you remember who his best friend was? Naturally, said Madame Rosmerta with a small laugh. Never saw one without the other, did you? The number of times I had them in here. Oh, they used to make me laugh. Quite the double act, Sirius Black and James Potter. Harry dropped his tankard with a loud clunk. Ron kicked him. Precisely, said Professor McGonagall. Black and Potter, ringleaders of their little gang, both very bright, of course, exceptionally bright, in fact, but I don't think we've ever had such a pair of troublemakers. I dunno, chuckled Hagrid. Fred and George Weasley could give 'em a run for their money. You'd have thought Black and Potter were brothers, chimed in Professor Flitwick. Inseparable. Of course they were, said Fudge. Potter trusted Black beyond all his other friends. Nothing changed when they left school. Black was best man when James married Lily. Then they named him godfather to Harry. Harry has no idea, of course. You can imagine how the idea would torment him. Because Black turned out to be in league with you-know-who, whispered Madame Rosmerta. Worse ever than that, my dear. Fudge dropped his voice and proceeded in a sort of low rumble. Not many people are aware that the Potters knew you-know-who was after them. Dumbledore, who was of course working tirelessly against you-know-who, had a number of useful spies. One of them tipped him off, and he alerted James and Lily at once. He advised them to go into hiding. Well, of course, you-know-who wasn't an easy person to hide from. Dumbledore told them that their best chance was the Fidelius charm. "How does that work?" said Madame Rosmerta, breathless with interest. Professor Flitwick cleared his throat. "An immensely complex spell," he said squeakily, "involving the magical concealment of a secret inside a single living soul. The information is hidden inside the chosen person or secret keeper, and is henceforth impossible to find, unless, of course, the secret keeper chooses to divulge it. As long as the secret keeper refused to speak, you-know-who could search the village where Lily and James were staying for years and never find them, not even if he had his nose pressed against their sitting-room window." "So Black was the Potter's secret keeper," whispered Madame Rosmerta. "Naturally," said Professor McGonagall. "James Potter told Dumbledore that Black would die rather than tell where they were, that Black was planning to go into hiding himself, and yet Dumbledore remained worried. I remember him offering to be the Potter's secret keeper himself." "He suspected Black," gasped Madame Rosmerta. "He was sure that somebody close to the Potters had been keeping you-know-who informed of their movements," said Professor McGonagall darkly. "Indeed, he had suspected for some time that someone on our side had turned traitor and was passing a lot of information to you-know-who. But James Potter insisted on using Black." "He did," said Fudge heavily, "and then, barely a week after the Fidelius charm had been performed, Black betrayed them," breathed Madame Rosmerta. "He did indeed. Black was tired of his double-agent role. He was ready to declare his support openly for you-know-who, and he seems to have planned this for the moment of the Potter's death. But, as we all know, you-know-who met his downfall in little Harry Potter. Powers gone, horribly weakened, he fled, and this left Black in a very nasty position indeed. His master had fallen at the very moment when he, Black, had shown his true colors as a traitor. He had no choice but to run for it." "Filthy, stinking turncoat," Hagrid said so loudly that half the bar went silent. "Shh," said Professor McGonagall. "I met him," growled Hagrid. I must have been the last to see him before he killed all of them. It was me what rescued Harry from Lily and James's house after they was killed. Just got him out of the ruins, poor little thing, with a great slash across his forehead, and his parents dead. And Sirius Black turns up on that flying motorbike he used to ride. Never occurred to me that he was what he was doing there. I didn't know he'd been Lily and James's secret keeper. Thought he'd just heard the news, or you-know-who's attack, and come to see what he could do. White and shaken he was. And you know what I did? I comforted the murderer and traitor." Hagrid roared. "Hagrid, please," said Professor McGonagall. "Keep your voice down. How was I to know he was upset about Lily and James? It was you-know-who he cared about, and then he says, 'Give Harry to me, Hagrid. I'm his godfather. I'll look after him.' Ha! But I'd had me orders from Dumbledore, and I told Black no. Dumbledore said Harry was to go to his aunt and uncle's. Black argued, but in the end he gave in, told me to take his motorbike to get Harry there. 'I won't need it any more,' he says. I should have known there was something fishy going on then. He loved that motorbike. What was he giving it to me for? Why wouldn't he need it anymore? Fact was, it was too easy to trace. Dumbledore knew he'd been the Potter's secret keeper. Black knew he was going to have to run for it that night. Knew it was a matter of hours before the Ministry was after him. But what if I'd given Harry to him, eh? I bet he'd have pitched him off the bike halfway out to sea. His best friend's son. But when a wizard goes over to the dark side, there's nothing and no one that matters to him anymore." A long silence followed Hagrid's story. Then Madame Rosmerta said with some satisfaction, "But he didn't manage to disappear, did he? The Ministry of Magic caught up with him next day." "Alas, if only we had," said Fudge bitterly. "It was not we who found him. It was little Peter Pettigrew, another of the Potter's friends. Maddened by grief, no doubt, and knowing that Black had been the Potter's secret keeper, he went after Black himself." "Pettigrew? That fat little boy who was always tagging around after them at Hogwarts," said Madame Rosmerta. "Hero worshipped Black and Potter," said Professor McGonagall. "Never quite in their league, talent-wise. I was often rather sharp with him. You can imagine how I regret that now." She sounded as though she had a sudden head cold. "There now, Minerva," said Fudge kindly. "Pettigrew died a hero's death. Eyewitnesses, muggles, of course, we wiped the memories later, told us how Pettigrew cornered Black. They say he was sobbing. Lily and James serious. How could you? And then he went for his wand. Well, of course Black was quicker, blew Pettigrew to smithereens." Professor McGonagall blew her nose and said thickly, "Stupid boy. Foolish boy. He was always hopeless at dueling. Should have left it to the Ministry. I tell you, if I'd got to Black before little Peter Pettigrew did, I would have messed around with wands. I'd have ripped him limb from limb. Hagrid growled. You don't know what you're talking about, Hagrid, said Fudge sharply. Nobody but trained hit wizards from the magical law enforcement squad would have stood a chance against Black once he was cornered. I was junior minister in the Department of Magical Catastrophes at the time, and I was one of the first on the scene after Black murdered all those people. I will never forget it. I still dream about it sometimes. A crater in the middle of the street so deep it had cracked the sewer below. Bodies everywhere, muggles screaming, and Black standing there laughing with what was left of Pettigrew in front of him, a heap of blood-stained robes, and a few fragments. Fudge's voice stopped abruptly. There was the sound of 5 noses being blown. Well, there you have it, Rosmerta, said Fudge thickly. Black was taken away by 20 members of the Magical Law Enforcement Squad, and Pettigrew received the Order of Merlin, first class, which I think was some comfort to his poor mother. Black's been in Azkaban ever since. Madame Rosmerta let out a long sigh. Is it true he's mad, Minister? I wish I could say that he was, said Fudge slowly. I certainly believe his master's defeat unhinged him for a while. The murder of Pettigrew and all those muggles was the action of a cornered and desperate man, cruel, pointless. Yet I met Black on my last inspection of Azkaban. You know, most of the prisoners in there sit muttering to themselves in the dark. There's no sense in them, but I was shocked at how normal Black seemed. He spoke quite rationally to me. It was unnerving. You'd have thought he was merely bored, asked if I'd finished with my newspaper. Cool as you please. He said he missed doing the crossword. Yes, I was astounded at how little effect the Dementors seemed to be having on him. And he was one of the most heavily guarded in the place, you know, Dementors outside his door, day and night. But what do you think he's broken out to do? Said Madame Rosmerta. Good gracious, Minister, he isn't trying to rejoin you-know-who, is he? I dare say that is his, eventual plan, said Fudge evasively, but we hope to catch Black long before that. I must say, you-know-who alone and friendless is one thing, but give him back his most devoted servant, and I shudder to think how quickly he'll rise again. There was a small chink of glass on wood. Someone had set down their glass. You know, Cornelius, if you're dining with the headmaster, we'd better head back up to the castle, said Professor McGonagall. One by one, the pairs of feet in front of Harry took the weight of their owners once more. Hems of cloaks swung into sight, and Madame Rosmerta's glittering heels disappeared behind the bar. The door of the 3 broomsticks opened again, and there was another flurry of snow, and the teachers had disappeared. Harry? Ron's and Hermione's faces appeared under the table. They were both staring at him, lost for words. Well, that was a little bit of turn of events for Harry there. You know, he thought he was sneaking in to have a good time, and turns out he snuck into a whole history of his past with his parents and stuff. Alright, let's see. Chapter 11, The Firebolt. Harry didn't have a very clear idea of how he had managed to get back into the Honeyduke cellar, through the tunnel and into the castle once more. All he knew was that the return trip seemed to take no time at all, and that he hardly noticed what he was doing because his head was still pounding with the conversation he had just heard. Why had nobody ever told him? Dumbledore, Hagrid, Mr. Weasley, Cornelius Fudge. Why hadn't anyone ever mentioned the fact that Harry's parents had died because their best friend had betrayed them? With that being said right there, if you watch the movie, Harry actually overhears Mr. Weasley talking to his wife and a couple of other people that information that Harry just learned, instead of Harry finding out in Honeydukes by the teachers and stuff. But he actually does learn about it from Mr. Weasley. He overhears Mr. Weasley talking about it with a few other people. But that's in the movie, though. Ron and Hermione watched Harry nervously all through dinner, not daring to talk about what they'd overheard because Percy was sitting close by them. When they went upstairs to the crowded common room, it was to find Fred and George had set off 6 dung bombs in a fit of end-of-term high spirits. Harry, who didn't want Fred and George asking him whether he'd reached Hogsmeade or not, sneaked quickly up to the empty dormitory and headed straight for his bedside cabinet. He pushed his books aside and quickly found what he was looking for, the leather-bound photo album Hagrid had given him 2 years ago, which was full of wizard pictures of his mother and father. He sat down on his bed, drew the hangings around him, and started turning the pages, searching, until he stopped on a picture of his parents' wedding day. There was his father waving up at him, beaming, the untidy black hair Harry had inherited standing up in all directions. There was his mother, alight with happiness, arm in arm with his dad, and there, that must be him, their best man. Harry had never given him a thought before. If he hadn't known it was the same person, he would never have guessed it was Black in his old photograph. His face wasn't sunken and waxy, but handsome, full of laughter. Had he already been working for Voldemort when this picture had been taken? Was he already planning the deaths of the 2 people next to him? Did he realize he was facing 12 years in Azkaban, 12 years that would make him unrecognizable? But the Dementors don't affect him. Harry thought, staring into the handsome, laughing face. "He doesn't have to hear my mom screaming if they get too close." Harry slammed the album shut, reached over and stuffed it back into his cabinet, took off his robe and glasses and got into bed, making sure the hangings were hiding him from view. The dormitory door opened. "Harry?" said Ron's voice uncertainly. But Harry lay still, pretending to be asleep. He heard Ron leave again and rolled over on his back, his eyes wide open. A hatred such as he had never known before was coursing through Harry like poison. He could see Black laughing at him through the darkness, as though somebody had pasted the picture from the album over his eyes. He watched as though somebody was playing him a piece of film, Sirius Black blasting Peter Pettigrew, who resembled Neville Longbottom, into 1,000 pieces. He could hear, though having no idea what Black's voice might sound like, a low, excited mutter. "It has happened, my lord. The Potters have made me their secret keeper." And then came another voice, laughing shrilly, the same laugh that Harry heard inside his head whenever the Dementors drew near. "Harry, you look terrible." Harry hadn't gotten to sleep until daybreak. He had awoken to find the dormitory deserted, dressed, and gone down the spiral staircase to a common room that was completely empty except for Ron, who was eating a peppermint toad and massaging his stomach, and Hermione, who had spread her homework over 3 tables. "Where is everyone?" said Harry. "Gone. It's the first day of the holidays, remember?" said Ron, watching Harry closely. "It's nearly lunchtime. I was going to come and wake you up in a minute." Harry slumped into a chair next to the fire. Snow was still falling outside the windows. Crookshanks was spread out in front of the fire like a large ginger rug. "You really don't look well, you know," Hermione said, peering anxiously into his face. "I'm fine," said Harry. "Harry, listen," said Hermione, exchanging a look with Ron. "You must be really upset about what we heard yesterday. But the thing is, you mustn't go doing anything stupid." "Like what?" said Harry. "Like trying to go after Black?" said Ron sharply. Harry could tell they had rehearsed this conversation while he had been asleep. He didn't say anything. "You won't, will you, Harry?" said Hermione. "Because Black's not worth dying for," said Ron. Harry looked at them. They didn't seem to understand at all. "Do you know what I see and hear every time a Dementor gets near me?" Ron and Hermione shook their heads, looking apprehensive. "I can hear my mum screaming and pleading with Voldemort. And if you'd heard your mum screaming like that, just about to be killed, you wouldn't forget it in a hurry. And if you found out someone who was supposed to be a friend of hers betrayed her and sent Voldemort after her, there's nothing you can do," said Hermione, looking stricken. "The Dementors will catch Black, and he'll go back to Azkaban, and serve him right. You heard what Fudge said. Black isn't affected by Azkaban like normal people are. It's not a punishment for him like it is for the others." "So what are you saying?" said Ron, looking very tense. "You want to kill Black or something?" "Don't be silly," said Hermione in a panicky voice. "Harry doesn't want to kill anyone, do you, Harry?" Again, Harry didn't answer. He didn't know what he wanted to do. All he knew was that the idea of doing nothing while Black was at liberty was almost more than he could stand. "Malfoy knows," he said abruptly. "Remember what he said to me in Potions. If it was me, I'd hunt him down myself. He'd want revenge. You're going to take Malfoy's advice instead of ours," said Ron furiously. "Listen, you know what Pettigrew's mother got back after Black had finished with him? Dad told me the Order of Merlin, first class, and Pettigrew's finger in a box. That was the biggest bit of him they could find. Black's a madman, Harry, and he's dangerous." "Malfoy's dad must have told him," said Harry, ignoring Ron. "He was right in Voldemort's inner circle." Say, you know who, will you?" interjected Ron angrily. "So obviously the Malfoys knew Black was working for Voldemort, and Malfoy'd love to see you blown into about 1,000,000 pieces like Pettigrew. Get a grip. Malfoy's just hoping you'll get yourself killed before he has to play you at Quidditch." "Harry, please," said Hermione, her eyes now shining with tears. "Please, be sensible. Black did a terrible, terrible thing, but don't put yourself in danger. It's what Black wants. Oh, Harry, you'd be playing right into Black's hands if you went looking for him. Your mom and dad wouldn't want you to get hurt, would they? They'd never want you to go looking for Black." "I'll never know what they'd have wanted, because thanks to Black, I've never spoken to them," said Harry shortly. There was a silence in which Crookshanks stretched luxuriously, flexing his claws. Ron's pocket quivered. "Look," said Ron, obviously casting around for a change of subject. "It's the holidays. It's nearly Christmas. Let's go down and see Hagrid. We haven't visited him for ages." "No," said Hermione quickly. "Harry isn't supposed to leave the castle, Ron." "Yeah, let's go," said Harry, sitting up, "and I can ask him how come he never mentioned Black when he told me all about my parents." Further discussion of Sirius Black plainly wasn't what Ron had in mind. "Or we could have a game of chess," he said hastily. "Or gobstones. Percy left a set." "No, let's visit Hagrid," said Harry firmly. So they got their cloaks from their dormitories and set off through the portrait hole. "Stand and fight, you yellow-bellied mongrels," down through the empty castle and out through the oak front doors. They made their way slowly down the lawn, making a shallow trench in the glittering, powdery snow, their socks and hems of their cloaks soaked and freezing. The forbidden forest looked as though it had been enchanted, each tree smattered with silver, and Hagrid's cabin looked like an iced cake. Ron knocked, but there was no answer. "He's not out, is he?" said Hermione, who was shivering under her cloak. Ron had his ear to the door. "There's a weird noise," he said. "Listen, is that Fang?" Harry and Hermione put their ears to the door. From inside the cabin came a series of low, throbbing moans. "Think we'd better go and get someone," said Ron nervously. "Hagrid?" called Harry, thumping the door. "Hagrid, are you in there?" There was a sound of heavy footsteps. Then the door creaked open. Hagrid stood there with his eyes red and swollen, tears splashing down the front of his leather vest. "You've heard?" he bellowed, and he flung himself into Harry's neck. Hagrid being at least twice the size of a normal man, this was no laughing matter. Harry, about to collapse under Hagrid's weight, was rescued by Ron and Hermione, who each seized Hagrid under an arm and heaved him back into the cabin. Hagrid allowed himself to be steered into a chair and slumped over the table, sobbing uncontrollably, his face glazed with tears that dripped down onto his tangled beard. "Hagrid, what is it?" said Hermione, aghast. Harry spotted an official-looking letter laying open on the table. "What's this, Hagrid?" Hagrid's sobs redoubled, but he shoved the letter toward Harry, who picked it up and read aloud. "Dear Mr. Hagrid, further to our inquiry into the attack of a hippogriff on a student in your class, we have accepted the assurances of Professor Dumbledore that you bear no responsibility for the regrettable incident." "Well, that's okay then, Hagrid," said Ron, clapping Hagrid on the shoulder, but Hagrid continued to sob and waved one of his gigantic hands, inviting Harry to read on. "However, we must register our concern about the hippogriff in question. We have decided to uphold the official complaint of Mr. Lucius Malfoy, and this matter will therefore be taken to the Committee for the Disposal of Dangerous Creatures. The hearing will take place on April 20th, and we ask you to present yourself and your hippogriff at the committee's offices in London on that date. In the meantime, the hippogriff should be kept tethered and isolated. Yours in fellowship." There followed a list of the school governors. "Oh," said Ron, "but you said Buckbeak isn't a bad hippogriff, Hagrid. I bet he'll get off." "You don't know them gargoyles at the Committee for the Disposal of Dangerous Creatures," choked Hagrid, wiping his eyes on his sleeve. "They've got it in for interesting creatures." A sudden sound from the corner of Hagrid's cabin made Harry, Ron, and Hermione whip around. Buckbeak, the hippogriff, was lying in the corner, chomping on something that was oozing blood all over the floor. "I couldn't leave him tied up out there in the snow," choked Hagrid, "all on his own, at Christmas." Harry, Ron, and Hermione looked at one another. They had never seen eye to eye with Hagrid about what he called interesting creatures, and other people called terrifying monsters. On the other hand, there didn't seem to be any particular harm in Buckbeak. In fact, by Hagrid's usual standards, he was positively cute. "You'll have to put up a good, strong defense, Hagrid," said Hermione, sitting down and laying a hand on Hagrid's massive forearm. "I'm sure you can prove Buckbeak is safe." "Won't make no difference," sobbed Hagrid. "Them disposal devils, they're all in Lucius Malfoy's pocket, scared of him. And if I lose the case, Buckbeak—" Hagrid drew his fingers swiftly across his throat, then gave a great wail and lurched forward, his face in his arms. "What about Dumbledore, Hagrid?" said Harry. "He's done more'n enough for me already," groaned Hagrid. "Got enough on his plate, what with keeping them Dementors out of the castle and Sirius Black lurking around." Ron and Hermione looked quickly at Harry, as though expecting him to start berating Hagrid for not telling him the truth about Black. But Harry couldn't bring himself to do it, not now that he saw Hagrid so miserable and scared. "Listen, Hagrid," he said, "you can't give up. Hermione's right. You just need a good defense. You can call us as witness." "I'm sure I've read about a case of hippogriff baiting," said Hermione thoughtfully, "where the hippogriff got off. I'll look it up for you, Hagrid, and see exactly what happened." Hagrid howled still more loudly. Harry and Hermione looked at Ron to help them. Shall I make a cup of tea?" said Ron. Harry stared at him. "It's what my mum does whenever someone's upset," Ron muttered, shrugging. At last, after many more assurances of help, with a steaming mug of tea in front of him, Hagrid blew his nose on a handkerchief the size of a tablecloth and said, "You're right. I can't afford to go to pieces. Gotta pull myself together." Fang the Boarhound came timidly out from under the table and laid his head on Hagrid's knee. "I've not been myself lately," said Hagrid, stroking Fang with one hand and mopping his face with the other. "Worried about Buckbeak and no one liking me classes." "We do like them," lied Hermione at once. "Yeah, they're great," said Ron, crossing his fingers under the table. "How are the flabberworms?" "Dead," said Hagrid gloomily. "Too much lettuce." "Oh, no," said Ron, his lip twitching. "And them Dementors make me feel ruddy terrible and all," said Hagrid with a sudden shudder. "Gotta walk past 'em every time I want a drink in the Three Broomsticks. It's like being back in Azkaban." He fell silent, gulping his tea. Harry, Ron, and Hermione watched him breathlessly. They had never heard Hagrid talk about his brief spell in Azkaban before. After a pause, Hermione said timidly, "Is it awful in there, Hagrid?" "You've no idea," said Hagrid quietly. "Never been anywhere like it. Thought I was going mad. Kept going over horrible stuff in me head. The day I got expelled from Hogwarts. Day me dad died. Day I had to let Norbert go." His eyes filled with tears. Norbert was a baby dragon Hagrid had once won in a game of cards. You can't really remember who you are after a while, and you can see the point of living and all. I used to hope I'd just die in me sleep. When they let me out, it was like being born again. Everything came flooding back. It was the best feeling in the world. Mind, the Dementors weren't keen on letting me go. "But you were innocent," said Hermione. Hagrid snorted. "Think that matters to them? They don't care. Long as they've got a couple of hundred humans stuck there with them so they can leech all the happiness out of them, they don't give a damn who's guilty and who's not." Hagrid went quiet for a moment, staring into his tea. Then he said quietly, "Thought of just letting Buckbeak go, trying to make him fly away. But how do you explain to a hippogriff it's got to go into hiding? And I'm scared of breaking the law." He looked up at them, tears leaking down his face again. "I don't ever want to go back to Azkaban." The trip to Hagrid's, though far from fun, had nevertheless had the effect Ron and Hermione had hoped. Though Harry had by no means forgotten about Black, he couldn't brood constantly on revenge if he wanted to help Hagrid win his case against the Committee for the Disposal of Dangerous Creatures. He, Ron, and Hermione went to the library the next day and returned to the empty common room laden with books that might help prepare a defense for Buckbeak. The three of them sat in front of the roaring fire, slowly turning the pages of dusty volumes about famous cases of marauding beasts, speaking occasionally when they ran across something relevant. "Here's something. There was a case in 1722, but the hippogriff was convicted. Ah, look what they did to it. That's disgusting. This might help. Look, a manticore savaged someone in 1296, and they let the manticore off. Oh no, that was only because everyone was too scared to go near it." That doesn't sound like very good research there. Meanwhile, in the rest of the castle, the usual magnificent Christmas decorations had been put up, despite the fact that hardly any of the students remained to enjoy them. Thick streamers of holly and mistletoe were strung along the corridors, mysterious lights shone from inside every suit of armor, and the great hall was filled with its usual 12 Christmas trees, glittering with golden stars. A powerful and delicious smell of cooking pervaded the corridors, and by Christmas Eve it had grown so strong that even Scabbers poked his nose out of the shelter of Ron's pocket to sniff hopefully at the air. On Christmas morning, Harry was woken by Ron throwing his pillow at him. "Oi, presents!" Harry reached for his glasses and put them on, squinting through the semi-darkness to the foot of his bed, where a small heap of parcels had appeared. Ron was already ripping the paper off his own presents. "Another sweater from Mum. Maroon. Again. See if you've got one." Harry had. Mrs. Weasley had sent him a scarlet sweater with the Gryffindor lion knitted on the front. Also, a dozen home-baked mince pies, some Christmas cake, and a box of nut brittle. As he moved all these things aside, he saw a long, thin package lying underneath it. "What's that?" said Ron, looking over a freshly unwrapped pair of maroon socks in his hand. "Dunno." Harry ripped the parcel open and gasped as a magnificent gleaming broomstick rolled out onto his bedspread. Ron dropped his socks and jumped off his bed for a closer look. "I don't believe it," he said hoarsely. It was a firebolt, identical to the dream broom Harry had gone to see every day in Diagon Alley. Its handle glittered as he picked it up. He could feel it vibrating and let it go. It hung in midair, unsupported, at exactly the right height for him to mount it. His eyes moved from the golden registration number at the top of the handle, right down to the perfectly smooth, streamlined birch twigs that made up the tail. "Who sent it to you?" said Ron in a hushed voice. "Look and see if there's a card," said Harry. Ron ripped apart the firebolt's wrappings. "Nothing. Blimey, who'd spend that much on you?" "Well," said Harry, feeling stunned, "I'm betting it wasn't the Dursleys." "I bet it was Dumbledore," said Ron, now walking around and around the firebolt, taking in every glorious inch. "He sent you the invisibility cloak anonymously." "That was my dad's, though," said Harry. "Dumbledore was just passing it on to me. He wouldn't spend hundreds of galleons on me. He can't go giving students stuff like this." "That's why he wouldn't say it was from him," said Ron, "in case some git like Malfoy said it was favoritism. Hey, Harry," Ron gave a great whoop of laughter. "Malfoy, wait till he sees you on this. He'll be sick as a pig. This was an international standard broom, this is." "I can't believe this," Harry muttered, running a hand along the firebolt, while Ron sank onto Harry's bed, laughing his head off at the thought of Malfoy. "Who?" "I know," said Ron, controlling himself. "I know who it could have been. Lupin." "What?" said Harry, now starting to laugh himself. "Lupin, listen, if he had this much gold, he'd be able to buy himself some new robes." "Yeah, but he likes you," said Ron, "and he was away when your Nimbus got smashed, and he might have heard about it and decided to visit Diagon Alley and get this for you." "What do you mean he was away?" said Harry. "He was ill when I was playing in that match." "Well, he wasn't in the hospital wing," said Ron. "I was there, cleaning out the bedpans on that detention from Snape, remember?" Harry frowned at Ron. "I can't see Lupin affording something like this." "What are you two laughing about?" Hermione had just come in, wearing her dressing gown and carrying Crookshanks, who was looking very grumpy, with a string of tinsel tied around his neck. "Don't bring him in here," said Ron hurriedly, snatching Scabbers from the depths of his bed and stowing him in his pajama pocket. But Hermione wasn't listening. She dropped Crookshanks on to Seamus's empty bed and stared, open-mouthed, at the firebolt. "Oh, Harry, who sent you that?" "No idea," said Harry. "There wasn't a card or anything with it." To his great surprise, Hermione did not appear either excited or intrigued by the news. On the contrary, her face fell, and she bit her lip. "What's the matter with you?" said Ron. "I don't know," said Hermione slowly, "but it's a bit odd, isn't it? I mean, this is supposed to be quite a good broom, isn't it?" Ron sighed exasperately. "It's the best broom there is, Hermione," he said, "so it must have been really expensive. Probably cost more than all the Slytherin's brooms put together," said Ron happily. "Well, who'd send Harry something as expensive as that and not even tell him they'd sent it?" said Hermione. "Who cares?" said Ron impatiently. "Listen, Harry, can I have a go on it? Can I?" "I don't think anyone should ride that broom just yet," said Hermione shrilly. Harry and Ron looked at her. "What do you think Harry's going to do with it? Sweep the floor?" said Ron. But before Hermione could answer, Crookshanks sprang from Seamus's bed right at Ron's chest. "Get him out of here!" Ron bellowed as Crookshanks' claws ripped his pajamas and Scabbers attempted a wild escape over his shoulder. Ron seized Scabbers by the tail and aimed a misjudged kick at Crookshanks that hit the trunk at the end of Harry's bed, knocking it over and causing Ron to hop up and down, howling with pain. Crookshanks' fur suddenly stood on end. A shrill, tiny whistling was filling the room. The pocket sneakoscope had become dislodged from Uncle Vernon's old socks and was whirling and gleaming on the floor. "I forgot about that," Harry said, bending down and picking up the sneakoscope. "I never wear those socks if I can help it." The sneakoscope whirled and whistled in his palm. Crookshanks was hissing and spitting at it. "You'd better take that cat out of here, Hermione," said Ron furiously, sitting on Harry's bed, nursing his toe. "Can't you shut that thing up?" He added to Harry as Hermione strode out of the room, Crookshanks' yellow eyes still fixed maliciously on Ron. Harry stuffed the sneakoscope back inside the socks and threw it back into his trunk. All that could be heard now were Ron's stifled moans of pain and rage. Scabbers was huddled in Ron's hands. It had been a while since Harry had seen him out of Ron's pocket, and he was unpleasantly surprised to see that Scabbers, once so fat, was now very skinny. Patches of fur seemed to have fallen out, too. "He's not looking too good, is he?" Harry said. "It's stress," said Ron. He'd be fine if that big stupid fur ball left him alone." But Harry, remembering what the woman at the magical menagerie had said about rats living only 3 years, couldn't help feeling that unless Scabbers had powers he had never revealed, he was reaching the end of his life. And despite Ron's frequent complaints that Scabbers was both boring and useless, he was sure Ron would be very miserable if Scabbers died. Christmas spirit was definitely thin on the ground in the Gryffindor common room that morning. Hermione had shut Crookshanks in her dormitory, but was furious with Ron for trying to kick him. Ron was still fuming about Crookshanks' fresh attempt to eat Scabbers. Harry gave up trying to make them talk to each other and devoted himself to examining the firebolt, which he had brought down to the common room with him. For some reason, this seemed to annoy Hermione as well. She didn't say anything, but she kept looking darkly at the broom, as though it, too, had been criticizing her cat. At lunchtime, they went down to the Great Hall to find that the house tables had been moved against the walls again, and that a single table set for 12 stood in the middle of the room. Professors Dumbledore, McGonagall, Snape, Sprout, and Flitwick were there, along with Filch, the caretaker, who had taken off his usual brown coat and was wearing a very old and rather moldy-looking tailcoat. There were only 3 other students, too, extremely nervous-looking, first-years, and a sullen-faced Slytherin fifth-year. "Merry Christmas," said Dumbledore as Harry, Ron, and Hermione approached the table. "As there are so few of us, it seemed foolish to use the house tables. Sit down, sit down." Harry, Ron, and Hermione sat down side by side at the end of the table. "Crackers?" said Dumbledore enthusiastically, offering the end of a large silver noisemaker to Snape, who took it reluctantly and tugged. With a bang like a gunshot, the cracker flew apart to reveal a large, pointed witch's hat topped with a stuffed vulture. Harry, remembering the Boggart, caught Ron's eye, and they both grinned. Snape's mouth thinned, and he pushed the hat toward Dumbledore, who swapped it for his wizard's hat at once. "Dig in," he advised, the table beaming around. As Harry was helping himself to roast potatoes, the doors of the Great Hall opened again. It was Professor Trelawney gliding toward them as though on heels. She had put in a green sequin dress in honor of the occasion, making her look more than ever like a glittering, oversized dragonfly. "Sybil, this is a pleasant surprise," said Dumbledore, standing up. "I've been crystal-gazing, Headmaster," said Professor Trelawney in her mistiest, most faraway voice, "and in my astonishment I saw myself abandoning my solitary luncheon and coming to join you. Who am I to refuse the promptings of fate? I at once hastened from my tower, and I do beg you to forgive my lateness." "Certainly, certainly," said Dumbledore, his eyes twinkling. "Let me draw you up a chair." And he did indeed draw a chair in midair with his wand, which revolved for a few seconds before falling with a thud between Professor Snape and McGonagall. Professor Trelawney, however, did not sit down. Her enormous eyes had been roving around the table, and she suddenly uttered a kind of soft scream. "I dare not, Headmaster. If I join the table, we shall be 13. Nothing could be more unlucky. Never forget that when 13 dine together, the first to rise will be the first to die." "We'll risk it, Sybil," said Professor McGonagall impatiently. "Do sit down. The turkey's getting stone cold." Professor Trelawney hesitated, then lowered herself into the empty chair, eyes shut and mouth clenched tight, as though expecting a thunderbolt to hit the table. Professor McGonagall poked a large spoon into the nearest tureen. "Tripe, Sybil?" Professor Trelawney ignored her. Eyes open again, she looked around once more and said, "But where is dear Professor Lupin?" "I'm afraid the poor fellow is ill again," said Dumbledore, indicating that everybody should start serving themselves. "Most unfortunate that it should happen on Christmas Day." "But surely you already knew that, Sybil," said Professor McGonagall, her eyebrows raised. Professor Trelawney gave Professor McGonagall a very cold look. "Certainly I knew, Minerva," she said quietly, "but one does not parade the fact that one is all-knowing. I frequently act as though I am not possessed of the inner eye, so as not to make others nervous." "That explains a great deal," said Professor McGonagall tartly. Professor Trelawney's voice suddenly became a good deal less misty. "If you must know, Minerva, I have seen that poor Professor Lupin will not be with us for very long. He seems aware himself that his time is short. He positively fled when I offered to crystal gaze for him." "Imagine that," said Professor McGonagall dryly. "I doubt," said Dumbledore in a cheerful but slightly raised voice, which put an end to Professor McGonagall and Professor Trelawney's conversation, "that Professor Lupin is in any immediate danger. Severus, you've made the potion for him again." "Yes, Headmaster," said Snape. "Good," said Dumbledore. "Then he should be up and about in no time. Derek, have you had any of these chipolatas? They're excellent." The first-year boy went furiously red on being addressed directly by Dumbledore, and took the platter of sausages with trembling hands. Professor Trelawney behaved almost normally until the very end of Christmas dinner 2 hours later. Full to bursting with Christmas dinner, and still wearing their party hats, Harry and Ron got up first from the table, and she shrieked loudly, "My dears, which of you left a seat first? Which?" "Dunno," said Ron, looking uneasily at Harry. "I doubt it will make much difference," said Professor McGonagall coldly, "unless a mad axeman is waiting outside the doors to slaughter the first into the entrance hall." Even Ron laughed. Professor Trelawney looked highly affronted. "Coming?" Harry said to Hermione. "No," Hermione muttered. "I want a quick word with Professor McGonagall." "Probably trying to see if she can take any more classes," yawned Ron as they made their way into the entrance hall, which was completely devoid of Mad Axe men. When they reached the portrait hall, they found Sir Cadogan enjoying a Christmas party with a couple of monks, several previous headmasters of Hogwarts, and his fat pony. He pushed up his visor and toasted them with a flagon of mead. "Merry Christmas." "Password, scurvy cur," said Ron. "And the same to you, sir," roared Sir Cadogan as the painting swung forward to admit them. Harry went straight up to the dormitory, collected the firebolt and the broomstick servicing kit Hermione had given him for his birthday, brought them downstairs, and tried to find something to do to the firebolt. However, there were no bent twigs to clip, and the handle was so shiny already it seemed pointless to polish it. He and Ron simply sat admiring it from every angle until the portrait hole opened and Hermione came in, accompanied by Professor McGonagall. Though Professor McGonagall was head of Gryffindor House, Harry had seen her in the common room only once before, and that had been to make a very grave announcement. He and Ron stared at her, both holding the firebolt. Hermione walked around them, sat down, picked up the nearest book, and hid her face behind it. "So that's it, is it?" said Professor McGonagall beatily, walking over to the fireside and staring at the firebolt. "Miss Granger has just informed me that you have been sent a broomstick, Potter." Harry and Ron looked around at Hermione. They could see her forehead reddening over the top of her book, which was upside down. "May I?" said Professor McGonagall, but she didn't wait for an answer before pulling the firebolt out of their hands. She examined it carefully from handle to twig ends. "And there was no note at all, Potter? No card, no message of any kind?" "No," said Harry blankly. "I see," said Professor McGonagall. "Well, I'm afraid I will have to take this, Potter." "What?" said Harry, scrambling to his feet. "Why?" "It will need to be checked for jinxes," said Professor McGonagall. "Of course, I'm no expert, but I dare say Madam Hooch and Professor Flitwick will strip it down." "Strip it down?" repeated Ron, as though Professor McGonagall was mad. "It shouldn't take more than a few weeks," said Professor McGonagall. "You will have it back if we are sure it is jinx-free." "There's nothing wrong with it," said Harry, his voice shaking slightly. "Honestly, Professor, you can't know that, Potter," said Professor McGonagall quite kindly. "Not until you've flown it, at any rate, and I'm afraid that is out of the question until we are certain that it has not been tampered with. I shall keep you informed." Professor McGonagall turned on her heel and carried the firebolt out of the portrait hole, which closed behind her. Harry stood staring after her, the tin of high-finished polish still clutched in his hands. Ron, however, rounded on Hermione. "What did you go running to McGonagall for?" Hermione threw her book aside. She was still pink in the face, but stood up and faced Ron defiantly. "Because I thought, and Professor McGonagall agrees with me, that broom was probably sent to Harry by Sirius Black." I mean, she could be right, but she could also be very wrong, to say the least. Okay, I'm trying to see this next chapter here. Alright. One second here, guys. I'm trying to see. Okay. Chapter 12. The Patronus. Harry knew that Hermione had meant well, but that didn't stop him from being angry with her. He had been the owner of the best broom in the world for a few short hours, and now, because of her interference, he didn't know whether he would ever see it again. He was positive that there was nothing wrong with the firebolt now, but what sort of state would it be in once it had been subjected to all those sorts of anti-jinx tests? Ron was furious with Hermione, too. As far as he was concerned, the stripping down of a brand new firebolt was nothing less than criminal damage. Hermione, who remained convinced that she had acted for the best, started avoiding the common room. Harry and Ron supposed she had taken refuge in the library and didn't try to persuade her to come back. All in all, they were glad when the rest of the school returned shortly after New Year and Gryffindor Tower became crowded and noisy again. Wood sought Harry out on the night before term started. "Had a good Christmas," he said, and then, without waiting for an answer, he sat down, lowered his voice, and said, "I've been doing some thinking over Christmas, Harry, after last match. You know, if the Dementors come to the next one, I mean, we can't afford you to—" "Well," Wood broke off, looking awkward. "I'm working on it," said Harry quickly. "Professor Lupin said he'd train me to ward off the Dementors. We should be starting this week, and he said he'd have time after Christmas." "Ah," said Wood, his expression clearing. "Well, in that case, I really didn't want to lose you as a seeker, Harry. And have you ordered a new broom yet?" "No," said Harry. "What? You better get a move on, you know. You can't ride that shooting star against Ravenclaw." "He got a firebolt for Christmas," said Ron. "A firebolt? No, seriously, a real firebolt?" "Don't get excited, Oliver," said Harry gloomily. "I haven't got it anymore. It was confiscated." And he explained all about how the firebolt was now being checked for jinxes. Jinxed? How could it be jinxed? "Sirius Black," Harry said wearily. "He's supposed to be after me, so McGonagall reckons he might have sent it." Waving aside the information that a famous murderer was after his seeker, Wood said, "But Black couldn't have bought a firebolt. He's on the run. The whole country's on the lookout for him. How could he just walk into Quality Quidditch Supplies and buy a broomstick?" "I know," said Harry, "but McGonagall still wants to strip it down." Wood went pale. "I'll go and talk to her, Harry," he promised. "I'll make her see reason. A firebolt. A real firebolt. On our team? She wants Gryffindor to win as much as we do. I'll make her see sense. A firebolt." Classes started again the next day. The last thing anyone felt like doing was spending 2 hours on the grounds on a raw January morning, but Hagrid had provided a bonfire full of salamanders for their enjoyment, and they spent an unusually good lesson collecting dry wood and leaves to keep the fire blazing while the flame-loving lizards scampered up and down the crumbling white-hot logs. The first divination lesson of the new term was much less fun. Professor Trelawney was now teaching them palmistry, and she lost no time in informing Harry that he had the shortest lifeline she had ever seen. It was Defense Against the Dark Arts that Harry was keen to get to. After his conversation with Wood, he wanted to get started on his anti-dementor lessons as soon as possible. "Ah, yes," said Lupin when Harry reminded him of his promise at the end of class. "Let me see. How about 8 o'clock on Thursday evening? The history of magic classrooms should be large enough. I'll have to think carefully about how we're going to do this. We can't bring a real dementor into the castle to practice on. Still looks ill, doesn't he?" said Ron as they walked down the corridor heading to dinner. "What do you reckon's the matter with him?" There was a loud and impatient "tuh" from behind them. It was Hermione, who had been sitting at the feet of a suit of armor, repacking her bag, which was so full of books it wouldn't close. "And what are you tutting at us for?" said Ron irritably. "Nothing," said Hermione in a lofty voice, heaving her bag back over her shoulder. "Yes, you are," said Ron. "I said I wonder what's wrong with Lupin, and you—well, isn't it obvious?" said Hermione with a look of maddened superiority. "If you don't want to tell us, don't," snapped Ron. "Fine," said Hermione haughtily, and she marched off. "She doesn't know," said Ron, staring resentfully after Hermione. "She's just trying to get us to talk to her again." At 8 o'clock on Thursday evening, Harry left Gryffindor Tower for the History of Magic classroom. It was dark and empty when he arrived, but he lit the lamps with his wand and had waited only 5 minutes when Professor Lupin turned up, carrying a large packing case, which he heaved onto Professor Binns' desk. "What's that?" said Harry. "Another Bogart," said Lupin, stripping off his cloak. "I've been combing the castle ever since Tuesday, and very luckily I found this one lurking inside Mr. Filch's filing cabinets. It's the nearest we'll get to a real Dementor. The Bogart will turn into a Dementor when he sees you, so we'll be able to practice on him. I can store him in my office when we're not using him. There's a cupboard under my desk he'll like." "Okay," said Harry, trying to sound as though he wasn't apprehensive at all, and merely glad that Lupin had found such a good substitute for a real Dementor. So, Professor Lupin had taken out his own wand and indicated that Harry should do the same. "The spell I'm going to try and teach you is highly advanced magic, Harry, well beyond ordinary wizarding level. It is called the Patronus Charm." "How does it work?" said Harry nervously. "Well, when it works correctly, it conjures up a Patronus," said Lupin, "which is a kind of anti-Dementor, a guardian that acts as a shield between you and the Dementor." Harry had a sudden vision of himself crouching behind a Hagrid-sized figure holding a large club. "Say that 10 times fast." Professor Lupin continued, "The Patronus is a kind of positive force, a projection of the very things that the Dementor feeds upon: hope, happiness, the desire to survive, but it cannot feel despair as real humans can, so the Dementors can't hurt it. But I must warn you, Harry, that the charm might be too advanced for you. Many qualified wizards have difficulty with it." "What does a Patronus look like?" said Harry curiously. "Each one is unique to the wizard who conjures it." "And how do you conjure it?" "With an incantation which will work only if you are concentrating with all your might on a single, very happy memory." Harry cast his mind about for a happy memory. Certainly nothing that had happened to him at the Dursleys was going to do. Finally, he settled on the moment when he had first ridden a broomstick. "Right," he said, trying to recall as exactly as possible the wonderful swirling sensation of his stomach. "The incantation is this." Lupin cleared his throat. "Expecto Patronum." "Expecto Patronum," Harry repeated under his breath. "Expecto Patronum. Concentrating hard on your happy memory." "Oh, yeah," said Harry, quickly forcing his thoughts back to that first broom ride. "Expecto Patronum. No, Patronum. Sorry, Expecto Patronum. Expecto Patronum." Something whooshed suddenly out of the end of his wand. It looked like a wisp of silvery gas. "Did you see that?" said Harry excitedly. "Something happened." "Very good," said Lupin, smiling. "Right then, ready to try it on a Dementor?" "Yes," Harry said, gripping his wand very tightly and moving into the middle of the deserted classroom. He tried to keep his mind on flying, but something else kept intruding. Any second now he might hear his mother again, but he shouldn't think that, or he would hear her again, and he didn't want to, or did he? Lupin grasped the lid of the packing case and pulled. A Dementor rose slowly from the box, its hooded face turned toward Harry, one glistening scabbed hand gripping its cloak. The lamps around the classroom flickered and went out. The Dementor stepped from the box and started to sweep silently toward Harry. Drawing a deep, rattling breath, a wave of piercing cold broke over him. "Expecto Patronum," Harry yelled. "Expecto Patronum. Expecto," but the classroom and the Dementor were dissolving. Harry was falling again through thick white fog, and his mother's voice was louder than ever, echoing inside his head. "Not Harry. Not Harry. Please, I'll do anything. Stand aside. Stand aside, girl." "Harry." Harry jerked back to life. He was lying flat on his back on the floor. The classroom lamps were alight again. He didn't have to ask what had happened. "Sorry," he muttered, sitting up and feeling cold sweat trickling down behind his glasses. "Are you all right?" said Lupin. "Yes." Harry pulled himself up on one of the desks and leaned against it. "Here." Lupin handed him a chocolate frog. "Eat this before we try again. I didn't expect you to do it your first time. In fact, I would have been astounded if you had." "It's getting worse," Harry muttered, biting off the frog's head. "I could hear her louder that time. And him, Voldemort." Lupin looked paler than usual. "Harry, if you don't want to continue, I will more than understand." "I do," said Harry fiercely, stuffing the rest of the chocolate frog into his mouth. "I've got to. What if the Dementors turn up at our match against Ravenclaw? I can't afford to fall off again. If we lose this game, we've lost the Quidditch Cup." "All right, then," said Lupin. "You might want to select another memory. A happy memory? I mean, to concentrate on? That one doesn't seem to have been strong enough." Harry thought hard and decided his feelings when Gryffindor had won the house championship last year had definitely qualified as very happy. He gripped his wand tightly again and took up his position in the middle of the classroom. Ready? Said Lupin, gripping the box lid. Ready, said Harry, trying hard to fill his head with happy thoughts about Gryffindor winning and not dark thoughts about what was going to happen when the box opened. Go, said Lupin, pulling off the lid. The room went icily cold and dark once more. The Dementor glided forward, drawing its breath. One rotting hand was extended toward Harry. Expecto Patronum, Harry yelled. Expecto Patronum. Expecto Pat... White fog obscured his senses. Big, blurred shapes were moving around him. Then came a new voice, a man's voice, shouting, panicking. Lily, take Harry and go. It's him. Go. Run. I'll hold him off. The sounds of someone stumbling from a room, a door bursting open, a cackle of high-pitched laughter. Harry, wake up. Lupin was tapping Harry hard on the face. This time, it was a minute before Harry understood why he was lying on a dusty classroom floor. I heard my dad, Harry mumbled. That's the first time I've ever heard him. He tried to take on Voldemort himself to give my mum time to run for it. Harry suddenly realized that there were tears on his face, mingling with the sweat. He bent his face as low as possible, wiping them off on his robes, pretending to do up his shoelace so that Lupin wouldn't see. You heard James? Said Lupin in a strange voice. Yeah. Face dry, Harry looked up. Why? You didn't know my dad, did you? I did, as a matter of fact, said Lupin. We were friends at Hogwarts. Listen, Harry, perhaps we should leave it here for tonight. This charm is ridiculously advanced. I shouldn't have suggested putting you through this. No, said Harry. He got up again. I'll have one more go. I'm not thinking of happy enough things. That's what it is. Hang on. He racked his brain. A really, really happy memory, one that he could turn into a good, strong Patronus. The moment when he'd first found out he was a wizard and would be leaving the Dursleys for Hogwarts. If that wasn't a happy memory, he didn't know what was. Concentrating very hard on how he had felt when he realized he'd be leaving Privet Drive, Harry got to his feet and faced the packing case once more. Ready? Said Lupin, who looked as though he were doing this against his better judgment. Concentrating hard. All right, go. He pulled off the lid of the case for the third time, and the Dementor rose out of it. The room fell cold and dark. Expecto Patronum, Harry bellowed. Expecto Patronum. Expecto Patronum. The screaming inside Harry's head had started again, except this time it sounded as though it were coming from a badly tuned radio, softer and louder and softer again, and he could still see the Dementor. It had halted, and then a huge silver shadow came bursting out of the end of Harry's wand to hover between him and the Dementor, and though Harry's legs felt like water, he was still on his feet, though for how much longer he wasn't sure. Ridiculous, roared Lupin, springing forward. There was a loud crack, and Harry's cloudy Patronus vanished along with the Dementor. He sank into a chair, feeling as exhausted as if he'd just run a mile, and felt his legs shaking. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw Professor Lupin forcing the Boggart back into the packing case with his wand. It had turned into a silvery orb again. Excellent, Lupin said, striding over to where Harry sat. Excellent, Harry. That was definitely a start. Can we have another go? Just one more go? Not now, said Lupin firmly. You've had enough for one night. Here. He handed Harry a large bar of Honeyduke's best chocolate. Eat the lot, or Madame Pomfrey will be after my blood. Same time next week. Okay, said Harry. He took a bite of the chocolate and watched Lupin extinguishing the lamps that had rekindled with the disappearance of the Dementor. A thought had just occurred to him. Professor Lupin, he said, if you knew my dad, you must have known Sirius Black as well. Lupin turned very quickly. What gives you that idea? He said sharply. Nothing. I just knew they were friends at Hogwarts, too. Lupin's face relaxed. Yes, I knew him, he said shortly, or I thought I did. You'd better be off, Harry. It's getting late. Harry left the classroom, walking along the corridor and around a corner, then took a detour behind a suit of armor and sank down on its plyth to finish his chocolate, wishing he hadn't mentioned Black, as Lupin was obviously not keen on the subject. Then Harry's thoughts wandered back to his mother and father. He felt drained and strangely empty, even though he was so full of chocolate. Terrible though it was to hear his parents' last moments replayed inside his head, they were the only times Harry had heard their voices since he was a very small child. But he'd never be able to produce a proper Patronus if he half wanted to hear his parents again. They're dead, he told himself sternly. They're dead, and listening to the echoes of them won't bring them back. You'd better get a grip on yourself if you want that Quidditch cup. He stood up, crammed the last bit of chocolate into his mouth, and headed back to Gryffindor Tower. Ravenclaw played Slytherin a week after the start of term. Slytherin won, though narrowly, according to Wood. This was good news for Gryffindor, who would take a second place if they beat Ravenclaw too. He therefore increased the number of team practices to 5 a week. This meant that with Lupin's anti-Dementor classes, which in themselves were more draining than 6 Quidditch practices, Harry had just 1 night a week to do all his homework. Even so, he wasn't showing the strain nearly as much as Hermione, whose immense workload finally seemed to be getting to her. Every night, without fail, Hermione was to be seen in a corner of the common room, several tables spread with books, arithmancy charts, rune dictionaries, diagrams of muggles lifting heavy objects, and file upon file of extensive notes. She barely spoke to anybody and snapped when she was interrupted. "How's she doing it?" Ron muttered to Harry one evening as Harry sat finishing a nasty essay on undetectable poisons for Snape. Harry looked up. Hermione was barely visible behind a tottering pile of books. "Doing what?" "Getting to all her classes," said Ron. "I heard her talking to Professor Vector, that arithmancy witch, this morning. They were going on about yesterday's lesson, but Hermione can't have been there because she was with us in Care of Magical Creatures, and Ernie Macmillan told me she's never missed a Muggle Studies class, but half of them are at the same time as Divination, and she's never missed one of them either." Harry didn't have time to fathom the mystery of Hermione's impossible schedule at the moment. He really needed to get on with Snape's essay. 2 seconds later, however, he was interrupted again, this time by Wood. "Bad news, Harry. I've just been to see Professor McGonagall about the firebolt. She got a bit shirty with me, told me I've got my priorities wrong. Seemed to think I cared more about winning the cup than I do about you staying alive, just because I told her I didn't care if it threw you off, as long as you caught the snitch first." Wood shook his head in disbelief. "Honestly, the way she was yelling at me, you'd think I'd said something terrible. Then I asked her how much longer she was going to keep it." He screwed up his face and imitated Professor McGonagall's severe voice. "As long as necessary, Wood. I reckon it's time you ordered a new broom, Harry. There's an order form at the back of which broomstick. You could get a Nimbus 2001 like Malfoy's got. A Nimbus 2001 like Malfoy's got. I'm not buying anything Malfoy thinks is good," said Harry flatly. January faded imperceptibly into February, with no change in the bitterly cold weather. The match against Ravenclaw was drawing nearer and nearer, but Harry still hadn't ordered a new broom. He was now asking Professor McGonagall for news of the firebolt after every Transfiguration lesson. Ron standing hopefully at his shoulder, Hermione rushing past with her face averted. "No, Potter, you can't have it back yet." Professor McGonagall told him the 12th time this happened, before he'd even opened his mouth. "We've checked for most of the usual curses. Professor Flitwick believes the broom might be carrying a hurling hex. I shall tell you once we've finished checking it. Now please stop badgering me." To make matters even worse, Harry's anti-Dementor lessons were not going nearly as well as he had hoped. Several sessions on, he was able to produce an indistinct silvery shadow every time the Boggart Dementor approached him, but his Patronus was too feeble to drive the Dementor away. All it did was hover like a semi-transparent cloud, draining Harry of energy as he fought to keep it there. Harry felt angry with himself, guilty about his secret desire to hear his parents' voices again. "You're expecting too much of yourself," said Professor Lupin sternly in their 4th week of practice. "For a 13-year-old wizard, even an indistinct Patronus is a huge achievement. You aren't passing out anymore, are you? I thought a Patronus would charge the Dementors down or something," said Harry dispiritedly. "Make them disappear." "The true Patronus does do that," said Lupin, "but you've achieved a great deal in a very short space of time. If the Dementors put in an appearance at your next Quidditch match, you will be able to keep them at bay long enough to get back to the ground." "You said it's harder if there are loads of them," said Harry. "I have complete confidence in you," said Lupin, smiling. "Here you've earned a drink, something from the 3 broomsticks. You won't have tried it before." He pulled 2 bottles out of his briefcase. "Butterbeer?" said Harry without thinking. "Yeah, I like that stuff." Lupin raised an eyebrow. "Oh, Ron and Hermione brought me some back from Hogsmeade." Harry lied quickly. "I see," said Lupin, though he still looked slightly suspicious. "Well, let's drink to a Gryffindor victory against Ravenclaw. Not that I'm supposed to take sides as a teacher," he added hastily. They drank the butterbeer in silence until Harry voiced something he'd been wondering for a while. "What's under a Dementor's hood?" Professor Lupin lowered his bottle thoughtfully. Well, the only people who really know are in no condition to tell us. You see, the Dementor lowers its hood only to use its last and worst weapon." "What's that?" "They call it the Dementor's kiss," said Lupin with a slightly twisted smile. "It's what Dementors do to those they wish to destroy utterly. I suppose there must be some kind of mouth under there, because they clamp their jaws around the mouth of the victim and suck out his soul." Harry accidentally spat out a bit of butterbeer. "What? They kill?" "Oh no," said Lupin. "Much worse than that. You can exist without your soul, you know, as long as your brain and heart are still working, but you'll have no sense of self anymore, no memory, no anything. There's no chance at all of recovery. You'll just exist as an empty shell, and your soul is gone forever. Lost." Lupin drank a little more butterbeer, then said, "It's the fate that awaits Sirius Black. It was in the Daily Prophet this morning. The Ministry had given the Dementors permission to perform it if they find him." Harry sat stunned for a moment at the idea of someone having their soul sucked through their mouth, but then he thought of Black. He deserves it, he said steadily. You think so? Said Lupin lightly. Do you really think anyone deserves that? Yes, said Harry defiantly. For some things. He would have liked to have told Lupin about the conversation he'd overheard about Black and the Three Broomsticks, about Black betraying his mother and father, but it would have involved revealing that he'd gone to Hogsmeade without permission, and he knew Lupin wouldn't be very impressed by that. So he finished his butterbeer, thanked Lupin, and left the History of Magic classroom. Harry half wished that he hadn't asked what was under a Dementor's hood. The answer had been so horrible. He was so lost in unpleasant thoughts of what it would feel like to have your soul sucked out of you that he walked headlong into Professor McGonagall halfway up the stairs. Do watch where you're going, Potter. Sorry, Professor. I've just been looking for you in the Gryffindor common room. Well, here it is. We've done everything we could think of, and there doesn't seem to be anything wrong with it at all. You've got a very good friend somewhere, Potter. Harry's jaw dropped. She was holding out his firebolt, and it looked as magnificent as ever. I can have it back? Harry said weakly. Seriously? Seriously, said Professor McGonagall, and she was actually smiling. I dare say you'll need to get the feel of it before Saturday's match, won't you? And, Potter, do try and win, won't you? Or we'll be out of the running for the 8th year in a row, as Professor Snape was kind enough to remind me only last night. Speechless, Harry carried the firebolt back upstairs toward Gryffindor Tower. As he turned a corner, he saw Ron dashing toward him, grinning from ear to ear. She gave it to you. Excellent. Listen, can I still have a go on it tomorrow? Yeah, anything, said Harry, his heart lighter than it had been in a month. You know what? We should make up with Hermione. She was only trying to help. Yeah, all right, said Ron. She's in the common room now, working, for a change. They turned into the corridor to Gryffindor Tower and saw Neville Longbottom pleading with Sir Cadogan, who seemed to be refusing him entrance. I wrote them down, Neville was saying tearfully, but I must have dropped them somewhere. A likely tale, cried Sir Cadogan. Then, spotting Harry and Ron, Good even, my fine young yeoman. Come clap this loon in irons. He is trying to force entry to the chambers within. Oh, shut up, said Ron as he and Harry drew level with Neville. I've lost the passwords, Neville told them miserably. I made him tell me what password he was going to use this week because he keeps changing them, and now I don't know what I've done with them. Odds bodikins, said Harry to Sir Cadogan, who looked extremely disappointed and reluctantly swung forward to let them into the common room. There was a sudden excited murmur as every head turned, and the next moment Harry was surrounded by people exclaiming over his firebolt. Where'd you get it, Harry? Will you let me have a go? Have you ridden it yet, Harry? Ravenclaw will have no chance. They're all on clean sweep 7s. Can I just hold it, Harry? After 10 minutes or so, during which the firebolt was passed around and admired from every angle, the crowd dispersed and Harry and Ron had a clear view of Hermione, the only person who hadn't rushed over to them, bent over her work and carefully avoiding their eyes. Harry and Ron approached her table, and at last she looked up. I got it back, said Harry, grinning at her and holding up the firebolt. See, Hermione, there wasn't anything wrong with it, said Ron. Well, there might have been, said Hermione. I mean, at least you know now that it's safe. Yeah, I suppose so, said Harry. I'd better put it upstairs. I'll take it, said Ron eagerly. I've got to give Scabbers his rat tonic. He took the firebolt and, holding it as if it were made of glass, carried it away up the boys' staircase. Can I sit down, then? Harry asked Hermione. I suppose so, said Hermione, moving a great stack of parchment off a chair. Harry looked around at the cluttered table, at the long arithmancy essay on which the ink was still glistening, at the even longer Muggle Studies essay, Explain Why Muggles Need Electricity, and at the rune translation Hermione was now poring over. How are you getting through all this stuff? Harry asked her. Oh, well, you know, working hard, said Hermione. Close up, Harry saw that she looked almost as tired as Lupin. Why don't you just drop a couple of subjects? Harry asked, watching her lifting books as she searched for her rune dictionary. I couldn't do that, said Hermione, looking scandalized. Arithmancy looks terrible, said Harry, picking up a very complicated-looking number chart. Oh, no, it's wonderful, said Hermione earnestly. It's my favorite subject. But exactly what was wonderful about arithmancy, Harry never found out. At that precise moment, a strangled yell echoed down the boys' staircase. The whole common room fell silent, staring, petrified, at the entrance. Why do you keep going off, cell phone? I can't stand those damn things listening in on you. Then came hurried footsteps, growing louder and louder, and then Ron came leaping into view, dragging with him a bedsheet. Look, he bellowed, striding over to Hermione's table. Look, he yelled, shaking the sheets in her face. Ron, what? Scabbers. Look, Scabbers. Hermione was leaning away from Ron, looking utterly bewildered. Harry looked down at the sheet Ron was holding. There was something red on it, something that looked horribly like blood. Ron yelled into the stunned silence. He's gone. And do you know what was on the floor? No, said Hermione in a trembling voice. Ron threw something down onto Hermione's rune translation. Hermione and Harry leaned forward. Lying on top of the weird spiky shapes were several long ginger cat hairs. Well, it looks like Crookshanks got a hold of Scabbers, or supposedly. We'll never know because they don't know. They just have hair and blood. So they don't even know. Alright guys, we're going to stop there. And we'll pick up next time. So I hope you guys enjoy. Thank you for listening in. Make sure to like and subscribe. Make sure you comment if you have anything you would like to add, or your opinions, your like input on the story, the books, the movies, anything like that. And I will see you guys next time for the next book reading. Much love, guys. Bye.